Hey guys, welcome back, or welcome if you're new here. Tonight, we're not in a palace or castle, or even a particularly nice dungeon. We're going much, much further back, to a time before stone halls, before recorded history, before the very concept of weeknights existed. We're going to the cold, whispering forests of ancient Scandinavia, to the long, dark winters where the only light came from hearth fires and the stories told around them. So find your spot, dim the lights, get comfortable, because we're not dealing with a simple king or queen tonight. We're dealing with the top of the godly org chart, the CEO of the Norse cosmos, the patriarch of a spectacularly dysfunctional divine family. We're talking about Odin, the Allfather, the one-eyed wanderer, the god who, in perhaps the most dramatic career development move in all of mythology, decided one day that the best path to ultimate knowledge was to hang himself from the world tree for 9 days and nights. A story of wisdom, sacrifice, and what happens when an immortal being has what we might call a profound midlife crisis. But to understand that moment, we have to understand the neighborhood he managed. The Norse cosmos wasn't a place of serene order. It wasn't the sunny slopes of Olympus, where gods lounged and bickered and had flings with mortals. No, the Norse worldview was, to put it mildly, a bit grim. It was a universe built on a foundation of inevitable collapse. At the center of everything was Yggdrasil, the world tree, an immense ash whose branches held the 9 realms. Its roots were gnawed by a dragon. An eagle sat at its top. A squirrel ran up and down, spreading gossip. It was less a pristine cosmic pillar and more a giant, living, slightly infested apartment complex for gods, giants, elves, and dwarves. And Odin's realm, Asgard, was the penthouse suite. Here, in his hall called Valhalla, he presided over a very specific retirement community for dead warriors. You died bravely in battle, you got picked up by Valkyries, and you spent your afterlife fighting all day in a field and feasting all night in a hall, waiting for the final, boss-level battle, Ragnarok, which you were destined to lose, because everything was destined to end in a fiery, frozen, monstrous apocalypse where almost everyone, gods included, would die. Cheery stuff. So Odin's job description was immense. He was a war god, a poetry god, a death god, a magic god. He was the patron of outcasts, kings, and hanged men. He had 2 wolves he fed at the dinner table and 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, who flew across the world every day and whispered the news of everything into his ears. Imagine having Twitter baked directly into your divinity, a constant whispering stream of every tragedy, every scandal, every bit of drudgery happening everywhere, forever. No wonder the guy was prone to drastic decisions. He looked the part, at least by the time the story solidified. An old man with a long gray beard, a wide-brimmed hat hiding his face, and a single, burning eye. Because, of course, he traded the other one for a drink from the well of wisdom. That was Odin's thing, a relentless, almost desperate pursuit of knowledge, not for the betterment of mankind, or even really for the safety of his own gods. It was a personal, gnawing hunger to know, to see the threads of fate, to understand the machinery of a universe he knew was doomed. He was the ultimate preparer for a meeting he knew would go disastrously. The kind of person who reads the apocalyptic weather report and then, instead of building a bunker, decides to learn advanced meteorology just so he can fully appreciate the scale of the incoming hurricane. His methods for gaining this knowledge were unconventional. They weren't scholarly. He didn't meditate on a mountain. He engaged in what we might generously call extreme psychic sports, which brings us to the incident with the tree. The story is told in the Havamal, the sayings of the High One, a collection of wisdom poetry put in Odin's mouth. He just mentions it, casually, like it's a weird summer vacation he once took. I know that I hung on a windy tree 9 long nights, wounded with a spear, dedicated to Odin, myself to myself, on that tree of which no man knows from where its roots run. Let's unpack that wonderfully bleak sentence. I hung on a windy tree. The tree is Yggdrasil, the cosmic axis, the thing holding everything up. He didn't just lean against it, he hanged himself from it. 9 long nights, a ritual number. 9 nights of darkness, of suspension between worlds. Wounded with a spear. He was stabbed, probably with his own spear, Gungnir, the one that never misses its target. So he's hanging, impaled from the world tree, dedicated to Odin, myself to myself. This is the crucial, almost paradoxical part. He's making a sacrifice to himself. He's the priest, the offering, and the god receiving the offering. It's a divine closed loop, a self-help ritual taken to its absolute horrifying limit. Why? What was the goal? The stanza continues. No bread did they give me, nor a drink from a horn. I peered downward. I took up the runes. Screaming, I took them. Then I fell back from there. The runes. Not just an alphabet. They were cosmic secrets, fragments of the universe's underlying code. Magical, powerful, dangerous. They were hidden, buried in the well beneath the tree, or perhaps within the tree itself in its roots that no man knew. Odin wanted them, and his conclusion was that the only way to gain them was to die a symbolic shamanic death, to hang as a sacrifice to himself, to teeter on the edge of actual dissolution for 9 days and nights until his consciousness, starved, parched, and in agony, finally slipped through the cracks of normal perception and into the secret layers of reality. Imagine the scene if you can. The winds of the void between worlds whipping around the great trunk, the ash tree groaning, a single figure, limp, swaying slightly, a dark shape against the endless star-dotted branches. No fanfare, no audience, just the distant chewing of the dragon at the roots, the chattering of the squirrel. 9 nights, no water, no food, just the slow burn of the spear wound, the creak of the rope, the gradual detachment from his own form. He peered downward, into the abyss, into the well of memory and fate, and there, in the depths, the runes, those shapes of power, finally revealed themselves. He grasped them, understanding flooding into him, and the cost of that understanding was a scream that echoed through the silent branches, a scream of agony and ecstasy before he finally, mercifully, fell back into his body, back into the realm of the living, forever changed. He gained the knowledge, but what did he lose? Well, apart from an obvious chunk of his sanity, the story gives us a clue. He was already one-eyed from the well incident. Now he's the god of the hanged. He carries the mark of the noose, the chill of the void in his very being. He becomes a patron of those who die his death, outcasts, criminals executed at crossroads. His wisdom is not clean or pure. It's painful, hard-won, and tainted with despair. Because when you stare into the machinery of a doomed universe for 9 days, you don't come back with a sunny disposition. And this really is the core of Odin's tragedy, wrapped in the garb of ultimate power. He's the Allfather, the wise king on the throne, and he's also the gaunt, desperate vagrant on the road, willing to do anything, sacrifice any part of himself for one more scrap of foresight. He's setting the table for a feast at the end of the world, meticulously arranging the cutlery, all while the roof was about to cave in. He collects the greatest heroes in Valhalla, not out of generosity, but to build an army for a battle they are prophesied to lose. His entire existence is a monument to futile, beautiful, stubborn preparation. It's the divine equivalent of knowing your house is termite-ridden, on a fault line, in a flood zone, with a meteor headed for it, and deciding your only course of action is to polish the silverware. Because the order of the cutlery is the one thing you might still control. So the next time you picture Odin, don't just see the stern, one-eyed king on his throne. See the desperate seeker, hanging alone in the wind, screaming into the void for a truth that would only deepen his gloom. The wisdom he bought with his eye and his suffering didn't save anyone. It just made him the most well-informed being at his own funeral. A funeral he'd been planning for and dreading from the beginning of time. But his family,
Oh, his family. The dysfunctional drama of the Aesir gods didn't start or end with Odin's tree-based introspection. He was the head of a household that made most royal dynasties look like a well-adjusted support group. We'll get to them. The trickster sun, the mighty but not too bright thunder god, the quiet, doomed sun, the wives, the giants, the scandals. But for now, let's just sit with the image of the Allfather, suspended, sacrificing himself to himself in the ultimate act of divine self-improvement. Because why go to a library when you can hang yourself from the fabric of reality for over a week? It sets a certain tone for the rest of the pantheon, doesn't it? The boss is like this. It's not going to get sunnier from here. Let's float over gently from the lonely, windy tree to somewhere ostensibly warmer, the hearth, the home, the domestic sphere. Because even the Allfather, in between hanging from cosmic axes and trading body parts for insight, had to go home sometime. He had a wife,
He had kids. He had, in theory, a family life. And if you think that realm was any less strange or fraught than his solo spiritual quests, well, you haven't been paying attention to how these stories go. Odin's wife was Frigg, queen of the Aesir, goddess of, well, motherhood, marriage, the hearth, foresight. She sat on her own high seat from which she could see all of fate. Which, when you think about it, means she and Odin were a couple who both had access to the ultimate spoilers for the universe. Their dinner conversation must have been a real delight. I saw the frost giants are massing near the river Eving. Yes, dear, I know. And I also know which of your chosen warriors will die there. Pass the salt. But there's a key difference in how they handled this terrible knowledge. Odin was a hoarder of information. He collected it desperately, through pain and sacrifice, and then used it to try and chess move his way around fate, even though he knew it was futile. Frigg, on the other hand, knew things, but often seemed to operate on a different wavelength. She was the power behind the throne, the weaver of destinies in a more literal, domestic sense. While Odin was out in his traveler's guise, causing wars and recruiting dead heroes, Frigg was managing the cosmic household. And like any managing partner, she had her own projects, her own secrets, and her own devastating blind spots. Their marriage, as presented in the myths, isn't exactly a love story for the ages. It's a political and divine merger. Odin, being Odin, had numerous other encounters. Frigg, for her part, had her moments of intrigue and independent action. They were less a romantic unit and more two powerful CEOs who shared a boardroom and occasionally a bed, united by the immense, stressful project of staving off the end of everything. The pressure in that divine hall must have been palpable. And then there were the children. Odin, again being Odin, had sired a small legion of offspring across the realms, with goddesses, with giants, with mortal women. But his sons with Frigg were the official heirs, the princes of Asgard. And here, the family tragedy deepens, because it focuses on the one who was universally beloved, Balder. Balder the Beautiful, Balder the Shining. If Odin was the brooding, one-eyed king of grim wisdom, and Thor was the booming, red-haired god of reliable smashy-smashy, Balder was the golden child. Literally. He was said to be so bright and fair that light shone from him. He was wise, gracious, kind, merciful. He was, in a pantheon of schemers, brutes, and tricksters, genuinely good. Of course he was. And in mythology, as in life, that's basically a target on your back. Balder started having dreams, dark, ominous dreams of his own death. Now, in Asgard, a dream wasn't just a bad night after eating too much mythical boar. It was a prophecy, a message, a direct feed from the well of fate. And when the shining god, the best of them, starts dreaming of his end, it sends a ripple of panic through the entire divine bureaucracy. It's like the company's most valuable, universally liked intern casually mentioning he's seen his own obituary. Odin's response is, characteristically, drastic and grim. He doesn't consult Frigg, who already knows anyway. He saddles his 8-legged horse Sleipnir and rides down to the land of the dead, Niflheim. He goes to the very source, to the hall of the corpse goddess Hel, to see for himself. And there he finds a feast being prepared, the halls decked out as if for a welcome. He uses his magic to rouse a dead seeress from her grave and questions her. Who is the feast for? The seeress, annoyed at being disturbed, tells him it is for Balder. The mead is being brewed, the place set. His death is not just a dream, it's a booking in the underworld's calendar. Odin rides back, his worst fears confirmed. The one pure thing in his otherwise bleak and strategic universe has an expiration date. Frigg's response is different. It's maternal, desperate, and meticulously practical. If Odin's move was to investigate the crime scene in advance, Frigg's was to attempt a total preemptive lockdown. She goes on a diplomatic tour of every single thing in all of creation, every metal, every stone, every disease, every animal, every element, fire, water, earth, air. She extracts an oath, a binding promise from each and every one that they will not harm her beautiful boy. It's an astonishing feat of cosmic diplomacy. Imagine the paperwork, the meetings. Hello, personification of rust. I need you to sign this affidavit swearing you won't corrode my son. Yes, Queen Frigg, of course. And you, Thornbush, you promise, swear on the root. And it works. They all swear. Every substance in the world pledges its innocence in advance. Balder becomes invulnerable. The Aesir, in a wave of relief, turn it into a game. They gather in the courtyard and take turns throwing things at Balder. Spears, stones, axes, daggers. They all turn aside or fall harmlessly at his feet. They laugh. It's a party. The terrible prophecy seems thwarted. The shadow is lifted. Balder stands there, smiling, bathed in light, the unkillable center of a joyful, violent carnival. And this is where the second child enters the story. The one who wasn't golden, the one who sat in the corner watching the game, not laughing. Loki. Loki is complicated. He's a blood brother to Odin, not a son by birth, but he's woven into the family like a thorn in the cushion of the high seat. A trickster, a shapeshifter, the god of fire, chaos, and clever plans that blow up in everyone's face. He's the guy you invite to the party because he's funny and interesting, but you spend the whole night nervously watching him near the drapes. He's part of the family, but he's also an outsider. His ancestry is giant, not god. He helps the Aesir often, but he resents them. He's insecure, brilliant, malicious, and deeply, terminally bored. He watches the gods pelting Balder with weaponry, roaring with laughter as everything fails to touch him. And he feels not relief, but a spike of pure, petty irritation. Of course they all love Balder. Of course he's perfect. Of course even the universe itself has sworn to protect him. It's too much. It's too smug. It's not fun. And for Loki, life is essentially a game to alleviate boredom. A game where the rules are for other people. So he does what he does. He puts on a disguise, an old woman's guise, because why not? And goes to have a chat with Frigg. He finds her in her chambers, presumably exhausted but satisfied from her world-spanning oath collection mission. He, as the old woman, compliments her on her son's invulnerability. What a clever mother you are to have protected him so completely. Did everything really swear an oath? Frigg, perhaps lulled by the praise, or perhaps just weary, admits that yes, well, almost everything. There was one little thing, so small and weak and harmless, out to the west of Valhalla, a sapling of mistletoe. It seemed too young, too insignificant to bother asking. It couldn't hurt anyone. Loki, internally smiling, thanks her and leaves. He goes west, finds the mistletoe, and carves a dart from it, sharp, slender, deadly in its symbolic innocence. Then he returns to the party, which is still in full swing. He finds the one god who isn't participating, Balder's own blind brother, Hoder. Hoder's standing at the edge of the fun, darkened not by malice, but by inability. He can't see to aim. He can't join in the game honoring his brother. He's just there, a quiet, sad figure on the periphery. Loki, the sociopathic facilitator, sidles up to him. Hey, Hoder, why aren't you honoring Balder? Hoder explains simply that he's blind. He can't aim. He has nothing to throw. Ah, says Loki. Here, let me help you. I'll guide your hand. Here's a little dart. I'll point you in the right direction. It's all in good fun. He places the mistletoe dart in Hodor's hand. He aims the blind god's arm. He gives the gentle push. The harmless, unsworn sprig flies across the courtyard. It strikes Balder, and it pierces him through. The shining god stumbles, falls, and is dead before he hits the ground. The silence dies. The party is over. The one thing Frigg missed, the one tiny, overlooked, insignificant detail has undone everything. Because in myths, as in life, it's never the big, obvious threat that gets you. It's the thing you didn't think to worry about, the loophole, the blind spot, the unassuming guest at the feast who nobody thought to vet. Silence, then a wail of collective grief that shakes the branches of Yggdrasil itself. The Aesir are frozen, horrified, all except Loki, who presumably melts back into the crowd, his boredom momentarily satiated, and Hodor, standing blind and confused, the unwitting, manipulated tool of his own brother's murder. Frigg's reaction is one of raw, untenable grief, but it quickly turns to a desperate, bureaucratic hope. There is a procedure. Death isn't always final in these stories. If someone can ride down to Hel, the goddess of the dead, and bargain for Balder's release, maybe it can be undone. Who volunteers for this hellish diplomatic mission? Hermithor the Bold, another of Odin's sons, steps up. He takes Sleipnir and rides for 9 nights down the dark, icy road to Hel's gate. Odin's reaction is quieter, but perhaps more profound. He leans over his dead son, and he whispers something into Balder's ear. What he says is never recorded. A secret? A promise? A father's farewell? A king's command? We don't know. It's one of the great silent moments in mythology. The god of knowledge who saw this coming, who rode to see the place settings, now faces the realized prophecy, and all he can do is whisper a mystery. Meanwhile, Hermithor reaches Hel. He finds Balder there, sitting in the place of honor, pale but himself. He pleads with the goddess Hel. He tells her of the grief in Asgard. He begs for Balder's release. Hel, who is actually another of Loki's children, by the way, the family connections here are a tangled, miserable web, considers. She is not without mercy, or perhaps she just appreciates good leverage. She sets a condition. If everything in the world, alive and dead, weeps for Balder, then he will be released to you. If anything refuses, he stays with me. It seems a simple task. The Aesir send out messengers to every corner of the 9 realms, and the world weeps. Men weep, giants weep, stones weep, metal weeps, the very earth weeps for the shining god. The messengers return, their task nearly done, and they find in a cave a giantess named Thok. They ask her to weep for Balder. She refuses. "Let Hel keep what she has," she says coldly. "I will weep dry tears for Balder's funeral." The messengers return, defeated, the one holdout, the one refusal. And of course, the giantess Thok is Loki in yet another disguise. He couldn't just kill Balder, he had to salt the earth afterward. He had to ensure that not only was the golden child gone, but that all hope of his return was systematically, personally extinguished by him. Balder's funeral is the next great set piece of Norse myth. They build a pyre on his great ship, Hringhorni. They place his body upon it. His wife, Nanna, heartbroken, lies down beside him and dies of grief. They place his treasures, his horse, all around. Thor, in a moment of both comedy and profound sadness, has to bless the pyre with his hammer. But he's so enraged by a dwarf who gets in the way that he kicks the poor creature into the flames. Odin lays upon the pyre his own ring, Draupnir, which drips 8 identical rings every 9th night. A symbol of endless wealth, of cyclical return, placed on a pyre for a god who will not return. He bends down and whispers to his son one more time, another secret for the journey. The pyre is lit. The ship is pushed out to sea. It burns, a towering beacon of loss against the water. Asgard watches its best part burn away. And where is Odin in all this? He is the architect of a system that failed. He is the knower of fates that he could not change. He sacrificed an eye, hanged himself, all for wisdom, and that wisdom only allowed him to see the precise contours of his own despair. He couldn't save his son. Frigg's exhaustive maternal diplomacy failed because of one oversight. Their combined omniscience was useless. The prophecy played out exactly as foreseen, with Loki as the gleeful, chaotic catalyst. This is the core of the Norse tragic sense. Knowledge doesn't empower you to change things, it just removes the comfort of ignorance. Preparation doesn't prevent disaster, it just makes you more aware of the steps as you walk toward it. Baldur's death is the point of no return. It's the first domino in the chain that leads directly to Ragnarok. The world after this is irrevocably broken. The shadow is now permanent. And Loki, well, Loki won his game. He alleviated his boredom. He proved that even the most perfect system has a flaw, and he was clever enough to find it. But in the family of gods, as in any family, there are consequences for ruining the reunion. The Aesir's grief would soon curdle into a cold, vicious rage, and Loki, the eternal outsider who craved attention, was about to get more of it than he could possibly handle. But that's a story for after the funeral smoke clears. For now, the ship is just an ember on the horizon, and the halls of Asgard are very, very quiet. The silence in Asgard after Baldur's funeral ship faded into the haze wasn't a peaceful one. It was a thick, heavy, oppressive quiet. The kind that sits in a house after a devastating loss, where every creak of a floorboard is a reminder of the absence, and where grief, given enough time and stillness, begins to ferment into something darker, into anger. And that anger needed a direction, a target. It didn't take a seeress, alive or dead, to figure out who that target was. Loki, for a while, seemed to think he'd gotten away with it, that his cleverness had once again insulated him from consequences. He was, after all, Odin's blood brother. He was part of the inner circle. He'd caused problems before, and there had been arguments, reparations, uneasy reconciliations. He mistook the silence for stunned acceptance. This was his first, and ultimately fatal, miscalculation. He made his second miscalculation by showing up to a feast, not in Asgard, even he wasn't that brazen, but at the hall of a wealthy mortal, or perhaps a minor sea god, named Aegir. The Aesir were all there, trying to drink through their sorrow. The atmosphere was already grim, and then Loki walked in. At first, they tolerated him. The silence grew colder, more brittle, but they said nothing. Loki, perhaps fueled by nerves or a desperate need to assert his place, did what he always did. He started talking. He began to insult the gods, one by one, to their faces. This was a known thing, a dangerous game he'd played before called flighting, a contest of verbal insults and boasts. But this time, the context was all wrong. The wounds were too fresh. His words weren't clever barbs, they were salt ground into a raw collective nerve. He mocked Odin's failed prophecies, he jeered at Frigg's maternal grief. He insulted Thor's strength, calling him a coward and a fool. He detailed with vicious precision every god's greatest failure or most embarrassing secret. He saved a special cruel focus for Sif's shorn hair, for Idun's kidnapping, for his own role in various disasters, wearing his transgressions like badges of honor. It was a performance of spectacular suicidal arrogance. He was testing the last fraying thread of their tolerance, and with every laugh that wasn't laughter, every sneer, he was sawing through it. Finally, the thread snapped. The gods rose. The time for words was over. Loki saw it in their eyes, the cold, murderous intent that not even his silver tongue could talk away. For the first time, perhaps, real fear cut through his smugness. He fled. What follows is a chase scene, but a slow, relentless, inevitable one. Think less high-speed pursuit and more the steady spreading stain of a hunt. Loki, the shapeshifter, used every trick. He turned himself into a salmon, blending into the cold rivers that fed from the mountains. He hid in a remote waterfall, thinking in the form of a fish, his mind racing, planning his next move.
But the gods had his number. They wove a net not of rope, but of destiny itself, or so the skalds said. A net with a mesh so fine nothing could slip through. They dragged the rivers, and Odin, with his one eye that saw so much, spied him in his hiding place. Loki, the salmon, realizing the net was coming, tried to leap over it in a desperate silvery arc. It was a beautiful, futile jump. Thor was waiting. The god of thunder, whose hands were made for catching, reached out and grabbed him mid-air, clutching him just behind the gills. The transformation fell away, and they had him. Wet, gasping, and finally, powerless. The judgment was in no doubt. The punishment, however, could not be simple execution. He was a god, however diminished. Killing him outright might have been too clean, too quick. And it wouldn't bring Balder back. No, the grief of the Aesir, particularly of Frigg and Odin, demanded something more poetic, more eternal. A punishment that was itself a living myth, a monument to their loss and his betrayal. They took him to a barren, remote cave, a place of dripping stone and echoing silence. They brought along his two sons by the giantess Sigyn, Narfi and Vali. And here the story takes its darkest, most uncomfortably cruel turn. The gods, in their rage, did not just punish Loki. They used his own family as the instruments of his torment. They turned Vali into a wolf, a wild, frenzied thing. And in this wolf form, Vali tore his own son Narfi to pieces. Loki was forced to watch. The father of monsters, the architect of a brother killing a brother through Hodor, was now made to witness the same horror visited upon his own children. The symmetry was hideous and undoubtedly intentional. But they weren't done. With Narfi's entrails still warm, they fashioned bonds. They used the sinews of his son as the cords to bind the father. They tied Loki down on 3 sharp slabs of stone, one under his shoulders, one under his loins, one under his knees. The bonds, made from his son's essence, were magical. They would tighten the more he struggled. They were unbreakable. And then, as a final touch, they took a great venomous serpent, some say another of Loki's monstrous offspring, and fastened it to a stalactite above his head. The snake's jaws were positioned so that a constant, slow, burning drip of venom would fall onto Loki's face. His wife, Sigyn, who had done nothing wrong, who had just witnessed one son murdered by the other, now made her choice. In an act of devotion that defines the words tragic and thankless, she stays with him. She cannot free him, she cannot soothe him, but she can, for moments at a time, spare him an increment of pain. She sits by his head with a simple bowl. She catches the dripping venom. This is the image. The bound trickster, pinned on stones of anguish, his son's entrails his shackles. Above, the relentless drip of poison. And his wife Sigyn, faithful, holding a bowl between him and the torment. The cave is silent but for the drip, drip, drip into the basin. Loki is conscious. He is immortal. He cannot go mad. He cannot die. He can only endure.
But the bowl fills. When it is full to the brim, Sigyn has to turn away to empty it. And in those moments, the venom falls directly onto Loki's face. The myth says he convulses so violently in his agony that the entire earth shakes. What we call an earthquake is, in the old stories, just Loki thrashing in his bonds as the poison burns him, his screams contained within the stone. Then Sigyn returns, places the bowl back, and the temporary, merciful ceasefire resumes. Until the next time. It is a punishment of perfect, horrific economy. It is endless. It is participatory, requiring the constant, sorrowful labor of the innocent to merely moderate it. It is intimately tied to his crimes, the destruction of family, the introduction of poison into the heart of Asgard, and it is a direct precursor to the end. For the myths tell us that Loki lies there, bound for ages, and his simmering, boundless hatred, stoked by the constant agony and the memory of his son's fate, grows and hardens. When the bonds finally break at the dawn of Ragnarok, he will rise not as a mischievous trickster, but as the captain of the ship of the dead, Nagfar, and lead the armies of chaos against the gods. His punishment doesn't neutralize him, it forges him into the final enemy. So let's consider the family portrait now. Odin, the Allfather, on his high seat, Hlidskjalf, his one eye seeing the slow march toward the doom his bound brother by oath will unleash. Frigg, who knows the same fate, sitting with her own silent knowledge. The golden sun, ash in the sea. The blind son, Hoder, who was a tool and will later be killed in turn by another of Odin's sons, Vali, a different one because the names recycle and it's all very messy, as a piece of cyclical vengeance. And in a cave far away, the uncle, the in-law, the chaos engine, bound and fermenting in hatred, tended to by the only person left who cares for him, who empties a bowl, over and over and over again. This isn't just a myth of punishment, it's a myth of consequence, of how grief, when handled with divine, unconstrained power, doesn't seek justice so much as it seeks a mirror for its own pain. The gods didn't just want Loki to suffer, they wanted to create a living tableau of suffering that reflected their own inner landscape. A cave where a family is destroyed over and over in perpetuity. And what of Odin's whisper, that secret he breathed into Baldur's ear on the pyre? Some say it was a promise that from this cataclysm, from this slow-burning revenge, a new world would eventually be born. That after Ragnarok, after the fire and the ice and the death of almost everyone, Baldur would return from hell to rule over a green, peaceful earth. That the whisper was a seed of hope planted in the heart of the end. But that's the thing about whispers. They're hard to hear over the dripping of venom and the grinding of tectonic plates caused by a god's convulsions and the soft, hopeless sound of a bowl being emptied, only to be filled once more. The machinery of apocalypse had been set in motion. The countdown began not with a roar, but with a snare in a river, a gut turned to rope, and a drip in a dark, forgotten cave. So, there we are. The pieces are now in place, set upon the board with a final, grim certainty. On one side, Asgard, the gods sitting in their golden halls, which now feel less like fortresses and more like very nice waiting rooms at the end of time. They've done the grief. They have enacted the revenge. They have, in binding Loki, created their own most dedicated enemy. The silence after the drama isn't relief. It's the silence of a sentence being passed, and the slow, ticking clock until it's carried out. This is the long twilight, the phase where everyone knows how the story ends, and the only thing left to do is watch the signs accumulate, like storm clouds gathering on a horizon you can't look away from. The myths from this point become a checklist, a series of prophecies spelled out in the Voluspa, the Sibyl's prophecy, that start to tick off one by one. It's less a narrative and more a cosmic to-do list for the apocalypse. The gods, for their part, don't just sit there, they try. Oh, they try. They prepare. But it's all very administrative. They're like a city council preparing for a hurricane they know will wipe the city off the map. They're going through the motions, updating emergency protocols, while outside the window, the sea is already beginning to recede, which is the last thing you want it to do. First, the environment goes. A long, bitter winter descends. Not just any winter, but the Fimbul winter. 3 winters back to back with no summer in between. The snow drives from every direction, the winds are knives. The sun and moon, forever chased by wolves across the sky, grow dim and weak. The world begins to starve and freeze. Societies fracture. The bonds of kinship and oath, so sacred to the Norse mind, snap under the pressure. It's a winter of the world and of the soul. In this perpetual gray, the wolves finally gain. Skull and Hati, the beasts who have been chasing the sun and moon since the beginning of things, finally catch up. They swallow their prey. The sky goes dark. The stars, the myth says, vanish from the heavens.
Imagine that. Not just a cloudy night, the utter, profound blackness of a cosmos where the last lights have been snuffed out. The world is now a frozen tomb waiting for the final disturbance. And the disturbances begin. In the east, in Jotunheim, the land of the giants, a horn is heard, the rallying cry. The giants, the eternal enemies of the gods, begin to muster. But they're not the only ones. From the fiery realm of Muspel to the south comes Surtur, the fire giant. He has been sitting there at the edge of creation for all of time, just tending his flame, waiting for his moment. Now he advances, a being of pure elemental conflagration, a sword of fire brighter than the sun that no longer exists, leading his legions. The frost and the fire, the two primordial extremes, are on the move. They're not allies, they're separate forces of annihilation converging on the same address. Then the noises, a crowing from the underworld. A rust-red crow crows in Hell's halls. Another, a golden one, crows for the gods in Valhalla. A third, soot-red, crows for the giants. They're alarm clocks for the dead, and the dead begin to stir. This is where one of Odin's more macabre hobbies comes due. Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain. For centuries, millennia, Odin's Valkyries have been curating an army. Every brave warrior who died with a sword in hand was brought here. They fight all day, feast all night, their wounds healing by dusk. It's the ultimate warrior's afterlife. But it was never a reward, it was conscription. They are the Einherja, the army of one, and they are Odin's personal reserve force for this exact day. The doors of Valhalla swing open, and this endless, drunk, battle-happy host pours out, forming ranks on the plain called Vigrid. They are countless, and they will not be enough. Other doors open too. In the deepest cave, the bonds that hold Loki, those sinews of his son, finally snap. The earth quakes one last violent time as he breaks free. He is changed. Centuries of venom dripping on his face, of hatred simmering in the dark, have done their work. The mischievous shapeshifter is gone. What emerges is a figure of pure, focused nihilism. He goes to the far shores where the ship Nogfar is moored, a ship made entirely from the untrimmed nails of the dead. A truly horrifying piece of nautical engineering, the result of a universal hygiene advisory everyone ignored. It's finally ready. Loki, now the helmsman, sets its course. He sails from the north, the ship packed with the inhabitants of Hell, a crew of pallid, silent corpses. His daughter, Hel, the goddess of that realm, probably stays behind to mind the store. The family business is, after all, destruction. And from the sea, another figure rises, Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, Loki's other famous offspring, the snake so big it circles the entire world, biting its own tail. It's been chilling at the bottom of the ocean since Thor tried to fish it up at one time. Now it feels the world's distress. It begins to writhe, to churn the seas into a frothing maelstrom. It hauls its impossibly vast coils onto the land, poisoning the earth and sea with its mere presence. It's heading for the plain as well. And from the woods, a familiar howl. Fenrir, the wolf, Loki's most troublesome son, the one the gods had bound with a magical ribbon forged from impossible things, the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. A ribbon called Gleipnir, thinner than silk and stronger than any chain. Tyr, the god of war and oaths, lost his hand to Fenrir's jaws securing that bond. Now, Fenrir breaks free too. He opens his jaws. One scrapes the earth, the other the sky. There is nothing in between but gullet. He is hunger incarnate, and he hasn't eaten in a very long time. So, let's set the stage. The plain of Vigrid. 100 miles wide in every direction, the stage for the last act. From the north,
Loki and the army of the dead on their nail ship. From the south, Surtur and the fire giants, flames trailing, turning the ice to steam. From the east, the frost giants rumbling in the dark. From the sea, Jormungandr, rising from the deeps. From the woods, Fenrir, his howls splitting the crumbling sky. And in the center, the Aesir and all the Einherjar, a glittering, magnificent, doomed host. The gods, to their credit, dress for the occasion. They put on their finest war gear, Odin dons his golden helmet, Thor grabs Mjolnir. They ride out to meet their fates. It's not a strategic battle. It's a series of appointed, fatal duels. The prophecy is a script, and they are actors who know their lines and their death scenes. Odin rides straight for Fenrir, the Allfather, the seeker of wisdom, the hoarder of knowledge, the king of gods, confronts the embodiment of mindless, destructive hunger. It's the ultimate conflict of order against chaos, of mind against appetite. And appetite wins. Fenrir swallows Odin whole, just consumes him. The god who hung himself for secrets is ended in the dark belly of a beast. It's a profoundly undignified, terrifyingly simple end. All that wisdom, all that sacrifice, all that kingly grandeur, gone in a gulp. Seeing this, Odin's son Vidar steps forward. Vidar, the silent god, the one who wears a shoe made from all the leather scraps humanity has ever trimmed and thrown away. He is the god of vengeance and silence. He places his foot, clad in this thick composite sole, on Fenrir's lower jaw. He grabs the wolf's upper jaw, and he tears. He rips the beast apart from mouth to tail. It's a brutal, visceral act of revenge for his father. But the father is still gone. Elsewhere on the field, Thor gets his rematch with Jormungandr. It's the fight he's always wanted, the epic struggle with the world serpent. He wades in, Mjolnir flashing, and strikes the great serpent on the head, finally killing it. He staggers back, 9 paces. The serpent's venom, spraying from its death throes, covers him. Thor, the mightiest of the gods, the protector of mankind, falls dead from the poison. The giant and the god kill each other, a draw in the most final sense possible. Tyr, the one-handed god of heroic glory, fights Garm, a monstrous hound guarding Hell's gate. They kill each other. Heimdall, the watchman with the horn that will signal the beginning, fights Loki. They've been enemies since the beginning, these two, and they kill each other. Freyr, the god of fertility and peace, fights Surtur. But Freyr gave away his magical sword years earlier for love. He fights with an antler. It goes about as well as you'd expect. Surtur kills him and then turns his flaming sword upon the world itself. Because that's the finale. Surtur swings his fire and the flames spread. They consume Yggdrasil. The world tree, the axis of everything, burns. The flames lick the sky. The earth, poisoned and frozen, sinks into the boiling sea. Stars fall. Darkness. Then all-consuming light. Then darkness again. And then silence. A silence so complete it is its own entity. Asgard is gone. Midgard is gone. Jotunheim, Hell, all of it. The chessboard has been swept clean. This is Ragnarok. Not a victory, not even really a defeat, a conclusion. The debt incurred from the moment the first god made an enemy, or broke an oath, or overlooked a sprig of mistletoe, has been called in. The universe's tab has been paid, in full, with fire. But remember Odin's whisper, the one he spoke to Baldur on the pyre. In the Völuspá, after describing the ashes and the silence, the seeress's vision continues. She sees something else. The earth, green and fresh, rising again from the water. A new sun, the daughter of the old one, shining in the sky. A few survivors stumble forth. 2 of Odin's sons, Vidar and Vali. Thor's 2 sons, who inherit Mjolnir. And from the hall of Hell, where the feast was once prepared,
come two figures, Balder and his blind brother Hodor, reconciled, healed, no longer prisoner and tool, but simply brothers returned. They find in the grass the golden chess pieces the Aesir once played with, a symbol of the game, ready to be played again, perhaps differently. And deeper in the new woods, they find two humans, Leaf and Leaf Thrasir, Life and Life Desirer. They hid themselves deep within Yggdrasil, nourished by the morning dew, and slept through the end of all things. They emerge into the new dawn. They will repopulate the world. A world without gods, without monsters, without the looming shadow of prophecy. A clean slate. So, what was Odin's whisper? Maybe it was this: I have seen the green place. I have seen your return. It doesn't make this any less terrible. It doesn't justify the pain, but it is what comes after. Carry that. The Norse cosmos is unique in its brutal honesty. It offers no permanent victory, no eternal reward, no final justice. It offers only cycles. The great, grinding wheel turns from order to chaos to destruction, and then from the ashes, a fragile green order begins again, unaware of the wheel, until the wheel turns once more. The gods weren't eternal stewards, they were participants in the cycle, and their time was up. Odin's entire project, the self-mutilation, the hanging, the hoarding of heroes, was an attempt to cheat the cycle, to arm himself against the inevitable downturn, and it failed spectacularly. All it did was ensure he met his end with his eyes wide open. He played the game perfectly, and he still lost, because the game was always rigged. The only comfort, the only scrap of meaning, was that the game would one day be played again by different pieces on the same board. So we end where we began, with a tree. Not the burning corpse of Yggdrasil, but a green shoot from a stump, with a whisper in the ear of a dead god, which was in the end a whisper to the future. It's a strangely hopeful ending, wrapped in layers of unthinkable catastrophe. A quiet morning after the longest, most violent night in history. And in a cave somewhere, if caves still exist, there is no bowl, no dripping venom, no bound trickster. Just silence, and perhaps the faint fossilized impression of where a wife once sat, her vigil finally, mercifully over. All the dramas, the pranks, the betrayals, the glorious battles, the whispered secrets, all of it is now just soil. Rich, dark, fertile soil, from which something new is growing, unaware of the price that was paid for its peace. And so, the fire burns out, not with a bang, not even with a whimper, but with a long, cooling sigh. The flames of Surtur gutter and die, having consumed their fuel, which was, essentially, everything. The boiling seas calm, steaming, gradually clarifying from a churning broth of ash and ruin to something still, dark, and deep. The silence that follows is the absolute hollow silence of vacancy, a canvas wiped utterly clean.
But this is Norse mythology, and in its stark, unsentimental logic, total annihilation is just inefficient, wasteful. Even in the prophecies of the seeress, after she has finished recounting the deaths of gods and the scorching of the tree, she takes a breath. She sees further. She sees, rising up, a second time, earth from the ocean, eternally green. It's not a triumphant fanfare. It's a simple, factual statement. The water recedes, mud appears, then grass. Imagine this new world, not a paradise, not a heaven, just land, quiet, empty, and profoundly unaware of itself. The sun, a new sun, the daughter of the old one, moves across a sky untainted by the memory of wolves. Her light is gentle, curious. It falls on a landscape with no landmarks, no history, no Jotunheim, No Asgard, no Midgard, just earth, water, stone, and the slow, patient work of lichen. And onto this stage walk the survivors. They are few, they are dazed, they are, in a way, ghosts. First, the gods, or what's left of them. Vidar, the silent avenger who tore Fenrir apart. Vali, another of Odin's sons, who survived the slaughter. They wander the fresh grass. They find, in a field, the golden chess pieces the Aesir once used, the Toffel board game. They pick them up. The pieces are cool, smooth, familiar in their hands. They sit, perhaps, on a fallen log that isn't really a log from anything that existed before, and they set up the board. They begin to play. They do not speak. What is there to say? They move the pieces in a game whose strategies were invented in a hall that is now less than ash. It's a ritual without meaning, a habit performed because the memory of habit is all that's left. Then, from another direction, come Modi and Magni, Thor's sons. They carry between them their father's hammer, Mjolnir. It is impossibly heavy, and yet they bear it, a tool of immense, world-shaping power in a world that has already been shaped, broken, and reshaped. What do you build with a hammer that once held back giants and slaughtered the world's serpent when there are no giants left to hold back and the only serpent is a memory in the soil? They will, the myths say, inherit their father's domain. Thunder, maybe, will rumble again someday, but for now, the hammer is just a relic, a very heavy, very potent relic. And then, the most poignant return. Two figures walking together, not from the battlefield, but from the memory of shadow itself. Balder and Höder, the shining god and his blind brother, the victim and the unwitting weapon. The poison of the mistletoe is gone. The bitterness of manipulation is gone. They are, simply, returned. Balder is no longer radiating that unbearable tragic light. He is just present. Höder can see, or perhaps he doesn't need to. They have all the time in the world now to talk or not talk, to be brothers without prophecy, without fate, without a mother's desperate oaths or a trickster's cruel games. Their return is the closest thing to a miracle this new world gets, and it is a quiet one. They just are. But gods, even surviving ones, are relics of the old cycle. The true inheritors of this green place are not divine. They are human, or they will be. Deep within the wood of Yggdrasil, or rather deep within what was Yggdrasil, within its heartwood that somehow survived the burning as an idea, a blueprint, two beings slept. Their names are Lif and Lifthrasir, life and eager for life. They hid there, sustained not by feasts or mead, but the morning dew. They slept through the screaming of gods, the cracking of mountains, the hiss of the sea boiling. They slept through the end. And now, as the new sun warms the bark of their refuge, they wake. They stumble out. They blink in the gentle, unfamiliar light. The world they knew, the villages, the fjords, the longhouses, the threats of trolls and the blessings of the gods, is gone, erased. They are alone. They have each other. They have the dew on their lips and a desperate, instinctive desire to continue. They are not heroes. They are not chosen. They are just the ones who happened to be hiding in the right piece of cosmic lumber. They will repopulate the earth. Their children will know nothing of Odin, of Thor, of Loki. The stories will become murmurs, then myths, then forgotten altogether. The great epic reduces over generations to a vague sense of something older, a shadow at the edge of the firelight. So, what does this new world have? It has grass, it has water, it has a sun and moon with no pursuers. It has a handful of divine survivors playing silent chess with the ghosts of their past. It has two humans confused and hopeful, with an entire empty planet to fill with their ordinary, magnificent, mundane business of living and loving and dying. And what does it not have? It does not have an Allfather on a high seat scheming. It does not have a thunderer defending it. It does not have a trickster weaving chaos. It does not have prophecies, because the script of the last world burned and no one has written a new one. It does not have Ragnarok looming on the horizon, because Ragnarok has already happened. The ultimate fear has been faced, and the world, in a sense, is free. This is the final quiet joke of the Norse cosmos. All that struggle, all that sacrifice, all that glorious and terrible drama was just to produce a blank page, a morning after with a mild hangover and no memory of the night before. Odin's whisper to Balder, the secret passed from father to dead son on the funeral pyre, might have been terribly simple. It might not have been a complex spell or a kingly command. It might have just been, "It will be quiet afterwards." And it is. We can picture Vidar looking up from his golden game piece, watching Lif and Yggdrasil wander in the distance, pointing at a bird they've never seen before. He doesn't go to them. He doesn't become their god. His time and the time of all his kind is over. They are now just part of the landscape, a slightly more melancholic part of the weather. The age of gods and monsters is a closed book on a shelf that no longer exists. So ends our long, slow look at the Allfather's wisdom and sacrifice. It was a path of pain sought for knowledge, which led to a throne of grief, which presided over a chain of events leading to a pyre for a son, which fueled a revenge that forged an enemy, which culminated in a battle that killed everyone and everything, which cleared the way for grass to grow and two very confused people to have a lot of children.
It's not a moral. It's not a lesson about the triumph of good or the wages of sin. It's a pattern, a cycle. From the single hanged figure on the tree seeking meaning, to the vast, chaotic tapestry of fate, to the fire that burns the tapestry away, to the green shoot that grows from the ashes, unaware of the tapestry that once was. The story doesn't promise that the new gods or the new people will be any better. They might make the same mistakes. The wheel might slowly start to turn again. But for now, in this moment after the end, there is just the dew, the grass, and a profound, echoing peace. A peace bought with an eye, a noose, a spear, a sun's entrails, and the screams of a dying universe. A real bargain when you think about it. So as the new sun dips below a horizon that has forgotten the taste of wolves, we can leave them there. The survivors, the beginners, the world eternally green, waiting for its first story to be told. And somewhere in the soil, the last faint echo of a whisper, telling the roots to grow. Not a command from a king, just a suggestion, from one piece of the old pattern to the new. Sleep well. The new world is green. The new world is quiet. But if you press your ear to the ground, not to listen but to feel, you might sense the faintest reverberation. Not a heartbeat, something slower. The geological memory of a fall. Because while the gods are gone and the great stories are over, the stuff of the old world didn't just vanish. It became substrate. It composted. And in any good compost, there are bits that haven't fully broken down. Little stubborn fragments of what came before. This is the part of the story that isn't about kings or apocalypses. It's about the leftovers, the echoes in the soil. Take, for instance, that golden chess piece Vidar and Vali found. It's not just a toy, it's a relic. And relics have a weight to them. In the hands of a surviving god, it's a memory. But if it were ever lost and found by one of Leif and Yggdrasil's great-great-grandchildren, That curious child would have no idea what it was. They'd see the worn glint, feel the strange craftsmanship. They might pocket it, and it would become a family oddity, a charm. The power it once held, the power of a god's distraction, of a strategy plotted in a hall now dust, would be gone. But its strangeness would remain. It would be the first seed of a new kind of story. Not a myth, but a folk tale. Why does grandfather's little gold man bring luck? And so, the divine degrades into the superstitious. The monumental becomes anecdotal. It's a gentler, slower form of survival. Then there's the hammer, Mjolnir, in the hands of Modi and Magni. They are gods of strength, their father's sons. But what is there to smash? There are no frost giants to break, no mountains that need challenging. The mountains are all new, unoffending. So what do they do with it? Perhaps they use it for its original, quieter purpose, a tool of consecration. They might walk the new fields, tapping the earth lightly, blessing the boundaries of nothing. The thunder that once followed its strike is now just a distant rumble in a clear sky, a meteorological afterthought. The hammer becomes a ceremonial object. Its power is diminished, but its purpose has softened. It awaits a new kind of threat, or perhaps it forgets what a threat even is. It becomes, like its bearers, a guardian of a peace so complete it borders on boredom. And the beings that weren't on the plane of Vigrid, the lesser spirits, the dwarves for instance, the myths are vague on their fate during Ragnarok. They were craftsmen, miners, makers of cursed rings and magical artifacts. Did they hide in their stone halls, deep in the earth as the fire raged above? It's a nice thought, that when the new earth solidified, a few soot-stained, grumpy dwarves might have pushed open their hidden doors, blinked in the unfamiliar natural light, and surveyed a world devoid of gods to commission them. No more orders for unbreakable chains, no more requests for golden hair. Just rock. They might have shrugged, gone back inside, and started crafting beautiful, useless things for the sheer joy of it. A chalice with no king to drink it from, a necklace with no goddess to wear it. Art for art's sake, finally. A quiet victory for craftsmanship over destiny. The giants, of course, are largely gone. But giant is sometimes just a word for the old, wild, untamed earth. The new mountains might remember, in their granite bones, the feeling of being Jotunheim. A particularly fierce storm rolling over a peak might have the faint, ghostly taste of a frost giant's breath. But it's just weather now. The personality has been scoured away by Surtur's fire, leaving only the elemental force behind. The terror becomes a natural phenomenon. The monster becomes a metaphor. And what of the places? The old geography of myth is melted away, but water has memory. A particular spring, bubbling up in a sun-dappled grove in this new world, might in its chemical composition be identical to the well where Odin sacrificed his eye. It holds the same cold, dark wisdom. If a thirsty human from the new race were to drink from it, they wouldn't see the face of fate. They might just get a sudden, inexplicable idea, a flash of insight, a bad feeling about a coming winter. They'd call it intuition. They wouldn't know they'd just sipped from the dregs of a god's bargain. This is how the old world persists, not in legends, but in instincts, not in names, but in patterns. The fear of the wolf that comes in the winter night, that's the ghost of Fenrir, diluted through millennia of sheep losses and dark forests. The respect for the lonely traveler on the road, that's a cultural memory of Odin the Wanderer, stripped of his name and his spear, reduced to a social nicety. The belief that a great sacrifice brings wisdom, that's the shadow of a hanged god on a tree, stretched so thin it's become a proverb. Even the new gods, should they ever arise from the beliefs of Leif and Leifthrisir, their children will be shaped by this buried bedrock.
They might be gods of harvest and hearth, seemingly brand new, but their edges will be subtly formed by the contours of what lies beneath. A god of justice might have a harder, more unforgiving edge, because Tyr's one-handed oath is down there somewhere. A god of poetry might come with a cost, a little too fond of metaphors about loss and eyesight, because a one-eyed god's bargain is part of the soil. And Loki? What of his echo? Chaos doesn't die. It changes state. The bound, dripping agony in the cave is gone, but the principle remains. It's in the unexpected lightning strike that starts a forest fire. It's in the strange mutation that makes a new species. It's in the laugh that breaks the tension at the wrong moment. It's no longer a personality with a grudge, it's a function of the universe, the random number generator in the code of the new world. Necessary, impersonal, and occasionally deeply inconvenient. This is the long, slow afterlife of myth. The glorious stories of gods and monsters are just the first, loudest draft. The final draft is written in the instincts of animals, the flow of rivers, the grain of wood, and the quiet, inexplicable traditions of people who have forgotten why they do what they do. So, as Lif and Lifthrasir build their first shelter, probably poorly, having had no one to teach them, they might choose a spot on a rise near a fresh stream. They don't know that the layout of the land gently echoes the placement of Asgard on a plain. They just think it has a good view. When their first child is born, the mother might hum a tune she's never heard, a lullaby with a rhythm that matches the gallop of an eight-legged horse. It just feels right. Odin's whisper, then, wasn't just to Balder. It was a broadcast, on a frequency so low it would take root in the bones of the world itself. It was the simple, terrible, hopeful knowledge that after the end, there is matter, and matter remembers, in its own way. It doesn't remember stories, it remembers shapes, stresses, patterns. The great sacrifice of the hanged god wasn't to save the old world, it was to seed the new one with a faint, fractal impression of the old one's lessons. The wisdom he bought wasn't for him to use, it was to become a mineral in the water, a trace element in the soil, so that when the new people, in their innocent ignorance, finally rediscover curiosity, they will find the ground already slightly fertile for it. When they feel the first pang of existential dread, there will be a faint, ancient resonance to make it feel profound, rather than just terrifying. The cycle doesn't just repeat, it learns. But it learns the way a forest learns to grow after a fire, by having the ash of the previous forest as its fertilizer. The new world isn't a rejection of the old, it's its afterlife, a quieter, greener, simpler afterlife. And in this endless, gentle afternoon of a new genesis, the only remaining drama is the profoundly slow one of geology and biology. A river cuts a canyon where once a god fell. A strain of wheat evolves that is especially hardy, its roots unconsciously seeking the nutrients left by a golden hall's dissolution. A human child is born with one eye a slightly different shade than the other, for no genetic reason anyone can trace. The stories are over. Long live the echoes. Sleep well. Time in this new green place behaves differently. Without the Norns weaving fate at the foot of the tree, without the anxious scrutiny of gods watching for portents, it simply passes. Not in chapters, but in layers, like silt settling in a slow river. Lif and Lifthrasir have children. Their children have children. Clearings become villages. Paths become trails. The world is populated by a people with no memory of a before. Their myths are of their own making. Why the fox has a white-tipped tail. Why the wind howls in a certain cave. They are simple, local stories. They are enough. But the old world, it doesn't haunt. Haunting is too active. It simply sits. It is present in the way certain things are. Take the concept of a king, for instance. When the descendants of Lif, many generations down, first feel the need to crown a leader, to centralize authority, the idea doesn't come from nowhere. The shape of it feels familiar, preordained. The throne they build, even if it's just a carved log in a longhouse, carries an unconscious gravity. They will instinctively give him a title that means father. They will expect him to be wise, to see far, to make hard choices for the people. They won't know they are sketching the faint, blurry portrait of a one-eyed god on a high seat. The template is in the soil. Kingship in this new world is born with a melancholy it cannot explain, a weight of foresight it doesn't require. Or the blacksmith, sweating at his forge, he learns to work iron, to make a plowshare, then a sword. The day he accidentally forges a piece that is perfectly balanced, that rings with a clear, singing note when struck, he will feel a strange pride. He will feel he has touched something deeper than craft. He might even call the sword a name. He doesn't know that the rhythm of his hammer, the clang-clang pause, is a distant, broken echo of a dwarf song in Nidavellir, or of Thor striking an anvil. The resonance of well-made has a divine ancestor. The poets, the skalds, they emerge too. They sit by the fire and spin tales of heroes, but their heroes fight bandits, or dragons, or rival clans. The scale is human. Yet when the poet reaches for a metaphor for immense sorrow, he might say, a grief as deep as the sea that drowned the old world. He doesn't believe an old world was drowned. It's just a phrase. It sounds right. It feels right. Because the sea in its deepest trenches remembers swallowing the ashes of Asgard. The language is picking up a chemical trace of the past. Even the social rituals are ghost-ridden. The feast where oaths are sworn on a ring, that feels solemn, heavier than a simple promise, because somewhere a ring called Draupnir melted in a divine funeral pyre, and the act of giving a guest the best seat, even if you don't know them, that's the ghost of a culture that once believed any stranger might be a god in disguise, testing hospitality. The disguise is gone, but the habit of cautionary respect remains. And what of the surviving gods? Vidar, Vali, Modi, Magni, Balder, and Hodor. What is their life in this endless, gentle afternoon? They are not worshipped. They are perhaps not even seen. They become phenomena. A traveler lost in the deep woods on the edge of starvation might stumble into a silent clearing and find two immense quiet figures playing a board game with pieces of stone. They do not look up. The traveler, in his delirium, might take them for strange trees or rocks and stumble past. The encounter becomes a weird story he tells later, the forest where the stones play games. The gods have become landscape features. Their consciousness, what's left of it, is turned inward, contemplating a game whose rules they are slowly forgetting. Their immortality has become a kind of geological persistence. Balder and Hodor might walk among the new humans sometimes, two tall, calm strangers who help mend a broken cart axle or who give directions at a crossroads with unsettling clarity. They are thanked, offered mead, but they refuse with a smile and move on. They are remembered as the kind strangers. No aura of light, no sign of blindness healed, just a helpfulness that feels slightly out of place, like a tool left behind by a previous tenant.
This is the slow forgetting. It's not a loss, it's a diffusion. The concentrated, potent essence of myth, the specific stories of Odin, Thor, Loki, dissolves into the groundwater of human experience. It becomes the flavor of the water, not the cup that holds it. The great, terrible arc of prophecy and destiny is broken. The new people live, love, feud, and die without the crushing weight of a foretold end. Their world will end, yes, someday, in a fire, an ice age, a slow entropy, but it won't be Ragnarok. It won't have a cast of characters and symbolic duels. It will be impersonal, almost boring. The drama has been drained from the apocalypse, leaving only the fact of it. And perhaps that was the final wisdom, the last fragment of the rune Odin grasped as he hung screaming, that the stories we tell about the end are always more vivid, more structured than the end itself. That chaos, in the final tally, is just noise, and order is just a temporary pattern in that noise. The glory of the gods was in their defiance of the noise, in their imposition of a narrative, a tragic, doomed, beautiful narrative onto the chaos. But the silence after the story is just the noise again, softer, gentler, but noise nonetheless. So we leave them. The gods as scenery, the artifacts as curiosities, the old terrors as instincts, the old loves as traditions. The last echo of the Allfather isn't a whisper, it's a pattern of behavior. A king looking troubled, a smith striving for perfection, a poet reaching for a metaphor he can't justify, a host being kind to a stranger. It's the echo of a sacrifice made not to change fate, but to embed a certain quality into the stuff of what comes next, a quality of seeking, of making, of wondering, of fearing, of honoring. The tree is gone, but the shape of its growth, the reaching for the sky, the digging into the dark, that pattern is now in the blueprint of every seed that sprouts in the green world. It grows not because it remembers Yggdrasil, but because Yggdrasil's way of growing is now the only way things know how to grow. The story is over. It has dissolved into the conditions for all future stories. The epic has become the climate. Sleep well. In the village that now stands where, in a previous reality, the roots of Yggdrasil once drank from a well of memory, a child digs in the soft earth behind her family's longhouse. Her spade, a sharpened stick reinforced with a strap of leather, strikes something that is not a root and not a stone. It clinks, a small, dull sound. She digs around it, her fingers scraping away the dark, rich loam. What she unearths is a piece of metal about the length of her hand. It is blackened, pitted with age, and furiously heavy for its size. One end is blunt and shattered. The other tapers to a point that seems to drink the light rather than reflect it. She carries it to her father, the blacksmith. He is a man who knows iron. He heats it, beats it, quenches it. It does not change. It does not sharpen. It does not melt. It is immutable. He pronounces it useless, too hard to work, too heavy for a tool, too ugly for an ornament. He tells her to throw it back into the midden. But she doesn't. It feels important. It feels full. She keeps it under her sleeping pallet. Sometimes, on still nights, she swears she can hear a faint, high hum coming from it, like a distant mosquito or a memory of lightning. She has, of course, found a shard of Gungnir, Odin's spear, the one that never missed, the one that wounded him as he hung from the tree. It was shattered on the plain of Vigrid, and this singular piece, no bigger than a finger, was blasted into the future, landing in the mud that would become her garden. Its power is gone. Its destiny is spent. All that remains is its absolute, stubborn there-ness. A piece of divine intent, now just a paperweight for a child's dreams. It will sit under that pallet for generations, passed down as an odd heirloom, its story shrinking each time until it is just the black bit of forever metal great-great-grandmother found. The spear that shaped fate is now a curiosity that slightly unnerves the dogs. This is how the mighty persist, not as legends, but as litter. Let's consider other found objects. A farmer, plowing a new field near a rising stream, turns over a curved yellow object the size of a dinner plate. It is smooth, impossibly so, and warm to the touch even on a cold day. He hangs it on his wall. It is, though no one will ever know, a scale from Jormungandr's shed skin petrified into a luminous ceramic. It gives the room a gentle, buttery light. His family thrives in that house. They attribute it to good luck and hard work. The scale's light is just a nice bonus. A fisherman pulling his nets in a deep fjord finds his catch strangely tangled around a branch, not wood, something like bone or antler twisted into a complex recursive spiral. It is light and stronger than any material he knows. He carves it into a button for his best jacket.
It is a fragment of the antler Freyr fought with, the one he wielded against Surtur in his doomed romantic stand. The god of fertility's last weapon is now a fastener for a wool coat. It does its job perfectly. It never comes loose. The great artifacts become trinkets. The monumental becomes mundane. This is the final quiet victory of time over story. The narrative importance leaks away, leaving only the functional, or the decorative, or the vaguely peculiar. But it's not just objects, it's places. That particularly treacherous pass in the mountains where winds whip unpredictably and the path seems to shift. The locals say it's just bad terrain. They don't know that Loki, in his final flight, changed shape 100 times in that airspace. The chaos of his panic imprinted itself on the local geology. The place isn't haunted. It's just, well, temperamental. It has bad habits left over from a previous tenant. The serene, perfectly circular lake that never freezes, even in the heart of the Fimbulwinter's echo. Mothers tell their children not to swim there, that it's bottomless. They're right. It is. The footprint of Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, striking the earth the last time. The impact vaporized rock and created a crater that filled with meltwater. The last act of the god of thunder is now a good swimming hole if you're brave enough to ignore the superstitions.
And the people themselves. Every so often, a child is born with a shock of hair so red it seems to burn. They are often strong, loud, prone to sudden bursts of laughter and equally sudden tempers. They are said to have the storm in them. No one makes the connection to a red-bearded god who loved ale and breaking things. It's just a family trait. Or the rare individual with one cloudy blind eye who yet seems to see more than anyone else. They become advisors, judges, wise women or men. They are said to have the sight. The idea that they paid for that sight with the other eye in a well of water at the world's root, that notion is long gone. The transaction is forgotten, only the result remains, attributed to bloodline or blessing. This is the long, slow settling of myth into the substrate of reality. The epic becomes ecological. The pantheon becomes a set of psychological and physical traits scattered across a population. The gods didn't die, they went particulate. Even the bad things, the sudden, inexplicable betrayal that sometimes fractures a family, people will call it a Loki come among them. They don't picture a grinning god with a dart of mistletoe. They mean a spirit of pure, petty discord. The concept has outlived the specific. The name has become a shorthand for an ancient, recurring human glitch. The profound, world-ending grief that follows the death of a truly good, beloved leader, they might say, it is like Balder has died again. They don't know who Balder was, they only know the phrase captures a certain quality of light leaving the world, a unique and universal sorrow. The specific story is lost, the emotional fingerprint is eternal. So what are Vidar and Vali doing, our silent chess players? They are still there. Their game has changed. They no longer use pieces, they use stones, leaves, the movements of birds. The game board is the world itself. They are no longer playing Toffel, they are playing at being patterns in the chaos. A wind blows a certain way, that is Vidar's move. A cloud obscures the sun, that is Vali's counter. Their immortality has become a form of permanent passive observation. They are the world's idle consciousness. If you were to sit very still in a remote place for a very long time, you might feel you were being watched by the landscape itself. That's probably them, not judging, just noting, keeping score in a game whose rules they themselves have forgotten. The new world, then, is not a blank slate, it is a palimpsest. The old writing is scraped away, but the groove of the stylus remains, influencing every new word written over it. The people live their lives on top of a ghost text. They feel its impressions when they make choices about justice, about courage, about loyalty, about sacrifice. They think they are inventing morality. They are, in fact, reading the faded lines of an old story, mistaking its plot for their own conscience.
And so the wheel is not reforged, it's buried. Its shape dictates the path of the roots that grow over it. The new age rolls forward not on the wheel of the old, but on a road that has been subtly, irrevocably contoured by the wheel's long rest. The last sound of the old world is not a scream or a crash, it is the clink of a child's stick on a piece of black metal. The final act is not a battle, but a discovery. Not an ending, but a finding. The stories are done. Now begins the long, quiet museum exhibit of the cosmos, where every relic is unlabeled and every visitor makes up their own caption. Sleep well. Generations are born, live, and die in the shadow of the great forgetting. The village becomes a town. The trails become roads. The stories of the old world are now not even echoes. They are the peculiar shape of the silence itself. People no longer say a Loki or like Balder. Those references have faded, like a watermark on parchment held too long to the fire. The concepts they described, however, have found new names, local ones. The inexplicable betrayal is now a red stripe mischief, after a particularly tricky weasel. The profound grief is the long lake chill, after the way fog hangs over a certain body of water for weeks. The myths have been naturalized. They have been filed off, labeled, and placed on the shelf of local phenomena. But the soil, if you could sift it with god fingers, is still thick with residue. Consider the founding of the first proper kingdom in this new age. A charismatic warrior, let's call him Harald the Unifier, manages to bring several fractious tribes under one rule. He is shrewd, he is ruthless when he needs to be, and he has a knack for appearing where he is least expected. At his coronation, a wandering skald presents him with a crown, not of gold, but of dark iron, woven into a stark, simple circle. It was forged, the skald says, from a fell star that landed in his grandfather's time. When Harald puts it on, a strange calm settles on the assembly. Decisions seem easier. His judgments feel inevitable. He rules for 50 years with an uncanny, weary wisdom. No one knows the iron was smelted from the filings of the fetters that bound Loki. The residue of constraint, of boundless chaos forced into a shape, now sits on the brow of a king, imparting not chaos, but the terrible, clear-minded certainty that comes from having once contained it. The crown doesn't make him a god. It just makes him a very, very good administrator of human chaos. His dynasty will be known for its stark, unforgiving justice. They won't know why. Or take the law speaker of a distant valley community. Her word is final in all disputes. She is known for her preternatural memory. She never writes anything down, yet she can recall the terms of a land grant from 10 generations back, the exact wording of a treaty, the precedent for every minor infraction. She says she hears the laws in the wind that comes off the high glaciers. The people think it's a metaphor. It isn't. That wind has passed through the bare branches of what was once Yggdrasil's highest twig. It carries not words, but the pattern of order, the clean, cold grammar of structure. She is unconsciously translating the weather of a dead universe into a legal code for goat herders. Even the wildlife is influenced. The wolves in the deepest forests are larger, smarter, and hunt with a terrifying coordination. They never overhunt. They seem to understand territory in a way that baffles naturalists. This is because, on a genetic level, they remember being Fenrir, not the myth, but the position of Fenrir, the apex predator, the bound enemy, the necessary counterforce to order. Their howls aren't just communication, they are a faint biological loyalty to a role they can't comprehend. They are performing ecosystem management based on a divine job description they lost eons ago.
And what of the ordinary folk? A blacksmith has a vision for a new kind of plow, one that cuts cleaner and turns the earth more deeply. He works for 3 years in a fever, neglecting his family, his health, everything. He forges and reforges, fails and tries again. When he finally succeeds, he collapses and dies the next winter, wasted but satisfied. He would say he was driven by a dream. He was. It was the dream of a dwarf who once toiled in Svartalfheim, whose name is dust, but whose drive to make the perfect thing leaked into the collective unconscious of craftsmanship. The smith didn't discover a new technique, he remembered an old one, from a different world. A mother, singing to a colicky baby, finds herself humming a tune with no beginning and no end, a looping, repetitive melody that seems to slow time itself. The baby sleeps. She doesn't know the tune is a corrupted fragment of the song the Norns sang as they wove fate. Its power to soothe isn't in its beauty, but in its mimicry of inevitability. It whispers to the infant soul, "This is the pattern. All is as it must be." And the child, recognizing on some primal level the voice of the weavers, relaxes. This is the insidious, total integration of the mythic into the mundane. The epic isn't remembered, it is replicated in miniature, endlessly, in the struggles and triumphs of utterly unaware people. Ragnarok was the big bang of this new universe, and all its laws, its physical and psychological constants are derived from the properties of the things that exploded. The gods themselves, the last survivors, have completed their transformation. Balder and Hudr are now literally part of the weather. Balder is the peculiar glowing quality of the air just before a perfectly clear dawn. Hudr is the deep, absolute quiet of a moonless night in the woods. Not a scary quiet, but a full, complete one. You can't see in it, but you don't need to. Vidar and Vali are the patient, grinding pressure of tectonic plates. Their chess game is continental drift. Modi and Magni are the sudden, explosive release of that pressure, the earthquake, the volcano. Not wrathful, just strong, doing their jobs. They are no longer beings, they are biomes, they are processes. The last vestige of conscious story is perhaps held in the objects, but even that is fading. The shard of Gungnir, passed down for 10 generations, is now set in the pommel of a sword belonging to a minor chieftain's son. He feels brave when he holds it. He attributes it to fine craftsmanship and his own spirit. He dies in a skirmish over a stolen sheep, his throat cut. The spear shard is looted, eventually finding its way into a merchant's box of curiosities. It will be sold, lost, found, melted down for scrap, and rejected again for being unmeltable. It will begin a slow, meaningless migration across the world, a pensioner from the War of Gods, now just a piece of very difficult rubbish. This is the true, final peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the absence of narrative conflict. The wars fought now are for land, for wealth, for slights. They are not chapters in a cosmic struggle. They are just things that happen. The heroes are brave, but their bravery won't be sung in mead halls for eternity. It will be remembered for 3 generations, maybe 4, before blending into the clan's foundational mythos. The tragedies are heartbreaking, but they are not echoes of a greater tragedy. They are just tragedy. The world has been cured of meaning. It is left with only cause and effect. It is, in a way, free. The crushing weight of prophecy, the anxiety of gods, the looming specter of a destined end, all of it was burned away. What grows in its place is both lighter and more profound. Life is no longer a prelude to Ragnarok. It is just life. A sunrise is just a sunrise, beautiful and meaningless. A death is just a death, sad and final. The universe no longer has a plot. It just has events. And so we end not with a revelation, but with a slow exhalation. The story of Odin, which began with a desperate act of self-sacrifice for wisdom, ends here, in a world where wisdom is just accumulated experience and sacrifice is just a painful choice.
The circle is not closed because circles imply a return. This line has been drawn and it goes on, terrain determined by the geologic memory of a circle that once was, but is no more. The Allfather's whisper was the first word of a story that consumed itself. The silence after is the only possible epilogue. A green, busy, chattering silence, full of the noise of living things who have never heard of runes or sacrifices or the end of all things. They are the lucky ones. They get to be simply what they are, the heirs to a fortune they don't know exists, spending it one ordinary, gorgeous, boring day at a time. Sleep well. The story is over. The world is just getting started. Again. And so we find ourselves here, at the end of the green silence. The last ember of the old world story has cooled to ash, and from that ash, nothing mythical will rise again. The compost is complete. The cycle of gods and monsters has run its course, leaving behind a world that is simply itself. It feels like a good place to stop, to let the quiet be the end.
But of course, history, the messy humankind, never really ends. It just changes channels. The descendants of Lif and Lifthrasir will eventually invent gunpowder and democracy and social media. They'll have their own dramas, their own tragedies, their own fleeting glories. But they will do so unburdened by the gaze of one-eyed wanderers or the schemes of mischief gods. Their follies will be entirely their own. Their triumphs will have no divine audience. It's a more lonely world, perhaps, but a more honest one. We've spent our time in the deep past, in the realm of prophecy and cosmic tree rings. We've watched a god hang himself for wisdom and end, centuries later, as a mineral in the water and a pattern in a king's brow. It's been a long, slow arc from a single desperate act to the universal diffusion of its consequences. If you've made it this far, thank you for lingering in the twilight with me. This particular story is told. But if you're in the mood to settle into another saga of flawed power, desperate choices, and the quiet, tragic comedy of people and gods and monsters trying to steer chariots that are perpetually on fire, well, there are other forests, other long, winding roads. Perhaps next time we could drift forward from myth into the murky, candlelit corridors of history, to a dynasty where the family drama was just as intense, the genetic puzzles just as fraught, and the consequences just as dire, though on a decidedly more human scale. A family not of gods, but of kings and queens, whose name alone conjures images of grandeur, guilt, and gallons of blood. The Tudors. Imagine a story beginning not with a world tree, but with a stolen crown, not with a god's sacrifice, but with a king's obsession for a son, not with a bound trickster, but with a court full of them in farthingales and doublets. The stakes are lower, the fate of a nation, not a cosmos, but the passions are just as high, the betrayals just as intimate, and the tragedies just as deeply, personally absurd. It's a tale with its own kind of prophecy, written not by Norns, but by diplomats and spies. Its own sacrifices, made not on trees, but on the chopping block. Its own golden children who die too young, and its own monstrous figures lurking in the royal nursery. The inbreeding isn't with giants, it's with your own cousin. The madness isn't from a snake's venom, but from a syphilitic mind and a paranoid heart. So, if you'd like to continue this quiet journey through the dark, ironic corners of the past, dim the lights once more. Get comfortable. The next story doesn't begin with a whisper to a dead god. It begins, as so many disasters do, with a man looking at his wife and thinking, "You are not enough." But that's for another night. For now, let the green world spin in its silent, contented orbit. The Allfather's work is done. The historian's work is never finished. Sleep well. Hey guys, welcome back. The fire's still low, the room is still dark. We've left the whispering forests and the cosmic ash behind. The air here smells different. Less pine and destiny, more damp stone,
tallow candles, and the faint iron tang of old blood. We've traded the world tree for a family tree, one just as gnarled, just as prone to splitting, and with thorns that are perhaps more personal. Tonight we begin not with a god, but with a banker. Or at least a king who wished he'd been a banker. A man so anxious, so clenched by the memory of insecurity that he would build a golden cage for a kingdom and call it peace. This is where our new story starts, not with a bang or a vision or a sacrifice, with a ledger, and a quiet, desperate man adding up the numbers of his own survival. Let's float gently down from the myths to the muddy fields of 15th century England. The Wars of the Roses are sputtering to a close. It's been 30 years of cousin against cousin, a whole noble class playing musical chairs on the throne, with the losers tending to find their heads on a spike rather than a cushion. The symbols were pretty, the white rose of York, the red rose of Lancaster, but the reality was just ugly, grinding, aristocratic civil war. By the end of it, the field is littered with dead princes. The royal lineage is a tangled, blood-soaked mess. And onto this stage walks Henry Tudor, the last man standing, or more accurately, the last man hiding in Brittany, waiting for everyone else to kill each other. He wins the crown at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1885, not through brilliant generalship, but because his opponent, Richard III, made a fatal charge and Henry's allies chose the right moment to switch sides. Henry is crowned King Henry VIII on the field with the circlets supposedly found under a hawthorn bush. It's not a majestic beginning, it's pragmatic, slightly seedy, and utterly symbolic of what's to come. He's a king by accident, by default, and by the cold calculus of exhausted politics. And he knows it. Every moment of every day for the next 24 years, he knows it. His claim to the throne is to be generous, creative. It runs through a line that had been declared illegitimate, and it relies on a maternal lineage that everyone had politely ignored for decades. He is a usurper, but a weary, prudent one. His entire reign will be an endless, neurotic project to make his shaky seat feel solid. So what does a man like this do? He doesn't throw grand tournaments. He doesn't compose poetry. He administers. He audits. He is the original micromanager king. He creates a system of bonds and recognizances, legal, financial traps for the nobility. Step out of line, show a hint of disloyalty, and you owe the crown a massive, crippling sum of money. He turned the entire aristocracy into a network of debtors. It was control, not through inspiration or fear, but through credit scores. He was less a lion of England and more its most ruthless, paranoid accountant. Of course, he needed a symbol, a story. The bloody roses had to be made into something marketable. So he married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of the previous Yorkist king, Edward IV, the White Rose. It was the political masterstroke of the century. He, the red Lancaster claimant, marries the white York heiress. The Tudor rose is born, white within red or red within white, depending on the propaganda pamphlet. A perfect, beautiful symbol of unity, grafted onto a marriage of chilly political necessity. They say it became a love match. Maybe it did. Elizabeth was known for her beauty, her grace, her saintly patience. She would need it. Henry was not an easy man to love. He was thin, pinched, with weary, cautious eyes that had seen too much exile and not enough security. He was haunted by pretenders to his throne, like the sad, convincing figure of Lambert Simnel, or the more dangerous Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be a lost York prince. These specters from the past meant Henry could never, ever relax. Every smiling face was a potential rebel. Every gift was a possible bribe. He lived in a prison of his own making, and he brought his family in with him. And yet they had children. Arthur, the firstborn, named for the legendary king, a clear signal.
This new dynasty is ancient, destined, royal. Then Margaret, Henry, Elizabeth, Mary, Edmund, Catherine, a nursery full of hope. But in a Tudor nursery, hope was a nervous condition. The heir, Prince Arthur, was the great white hope. He was married off to the ultimate prize, Catherine of Aragon, a princess of Spain, the daughter of the legendary Ferdinand and Isabella. It was a colossal diplomatic coup. It tied this new, weird English dynasty to the most powerful Catholic monarchs in Europe. Arthur was 15, Catherine was 16. They were married in a splendid ceremony in 1501, and then they were sent to Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border to set up their princely court. 6 months later, Arthur was dead, probably of the sweating sickness, a terrifyingly fast epidemic that could kill a healthy person in hours. The Golden Prince, the human keystone of Henry VIII's fragile arch, was gone, just like that. The king was devastated, but his grief immediately took the form of a financial and diplomatic problem. Catherine was now a widow, stranded in a foreign country. Her dowry, half of which was still unpaid, was a huge sum. Henry VII's accountant's soul revolted at the idea of sending her back and giving the money back. So he kept her, for years, in a state of miserable limbo, pawned between the English and Spanish courts, her status unclear, her future bleak. She was a living asset on a balance sheet, and her value was in dispute. And then a second blow. Henry's queen, his beautiful Elizabeth of York, died in 1503, on her 37th birthday, from complications following the birth of a short-lived daughter, Catherine. The light, whatever softness there was in Henry's hard life, went out. Contemporary accounts say he privily departed to a solitary place, and would no man should resort unto him. He grieved, deeply and silently, and then he got back to work. The ledger awaited. His personality curled further. He became more reclusive, more obsessed with money, more suspicious. He squeezed the nobility until they wept. He hoarded treasure in his private chambers, counting it himself. He was preparing his second son, the new heir, for a throne that would be financially secure and politically stifled. That second son was Henry, the spare, the one who was destined for the church, a life of archbishoprics and theological debate, a robust, red-headed, energetic boy, taught by the finest Renaissance scholars, a natural athlete, a lover of music and jousting and show. He was everything his father was not, extroverted, confident, physically magnificent, effortlessly charming. He'd grown up in the shadow of his delicate older brother, and now that shadow was gone, replaced by the long, thin, anxious one of his father. Henry VII died in 1509 in his palace of Richmond, which he'd built himself. He left it.
The old king, Henry VII, died in the spring of 1509. He died as he lived, in a room full of accounts, likely with the smell of ink and parchment more familiar to him than the scent of his gardens. He left behind a country that was, for the first time in generations, not actively at war with itself. He also left a treasury so swollen it was practically indecent. And he left an heir who was, in almost every conceivable way, his polar opposite. Imagine the scene. The somber, black-clad courtiers, the hushed whispers, the relieved, barely concealed sighs from the nobility who had been financially bled white for 2 decades. And then the door swings open. In walks the new king, Henry VIII. He is 17 years old. He's a giant for his time, over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with fiery red-gold hair and a complexion so fair they called him the rose without a thorn. He is athletic, a champion wrestler and jouster. He speaks 4 languages, writes music, sings with a clear tenor voice. He is, in the parlance of the time, a very big deal. His first order of business after the funeral was to marry, and not just anyone. He married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. Now, this required a bit of theological paperwork. There's a line in the book of Leviticus about not marrying your brother's wife. It's rather clear. But the Tudors had a knack for creative interpretation. They secured a papal dispensation, arguing that Arthur and Catherine's marriage had never been consummated. Catherine swore this was true. Young Henry, eager for both a wife and a powerful Spanish alliance, was happy to believe it. So they married, quietly, just a few weeks after the old king's death. It was less a romantic overture and more the final move in his father's chess game. Henry VIII's ledger was finally balanced. The Spanish princess and the remainder of her dowry were now permanently on the Tudor balance sheet. But if the marriage was a political calculation, Henry's early reign was a calculated rejection of everything his father represented. Henry VIII's court had been a place of whispered audits and subdued colors. Henry VIII's court exploded in a riot of color, noise, and expense. Gold cloth, intricate masks, endless tournaments, lavish feasts featuring sugary sculptures called subtleties that were architectural marvels. The money his father had pinched and hoarded, Henry began to spend like water. He was performing kingship. He was building a myth in real time, the myth of the Golden Prince, the Renaissance monarch, the new Arthur. And Catherine was, at first, the perfect queen for this show. Older, wiser, steady, devout, and deeply grateful to finally have a position and a purpose. She served as regent when Henry went to war with France in 1513, and while he was across the Channel, jousting and pageantry he called a campaign, the Battle of the Spurs was less a battle and more a leisurely French retreat, Catherine oversaw a real battle at home. The Scots invaded, and at the Battle of Flodden, the English forces crushed them, killing King James IV of Scotland, Catherine's own brother-in-law, and a significant chunk of the Scottish nobility. She sent Henry the bloodied coat of the dead king as a trophy. She was a capable, tough medieval queen in an age that was starting to want something else. For a while, it worked. The pageant was glorious. Henry had his best friend, the dazzling, intellectual Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, a butcher's son with a mind like a supercomputer, to run the actual business of government. Wolsey became Lord Chancellor, the power behind the throne, organizing everything from foreign policy to the king's entertainment. Henry could focus on being magnificent. He wrestled ambassadors, he composed songs called Pastime with Good Company. He jousted with such ferocity, he occasionally nearly killed himself. He was the Sun King, and his court orbited around his blistering, demanding energy. But there was a crack in the golden facade, a deep, persistent, and profoundly personal one. The nursery was empty. Catherine's pregnancies became a tragic, repetitive cycle. A daughter, stillborn. A son, Henry, Duke of Cornwall, who lived for 52 days in 1511. The kingdom celebrated, then mourned. A miscarriage. Another short-lived son. Then, in 1516, a child who lived. A daughter. They named her Mary. Henry put on a brave face. He said, "We're both young. If it was a daughter this time, by the grace of God, sons will follow." But the grace of God seemed to be on hiatus. More pregnancies followed, more miscarriages, a final heartbreaking stillborn son in 1518, and then nothing. Catherine, worn out by grief and the physical toll of constant. What followed was not a swift divorce. It was a 7-year legal, diplomatic, and theological siege. The king's great matter. It would cost him his friendship with Wolsey, who failed to deliver the annulment from the Pope. It would alienate him from the Holy Roman Emperor and the Spanish crown. It would bring a humble, brilliant Cambridge scholar named Thomas Cranmer to the fore, and a ruthless, efficient administrator named Thomas Cromwell. It would lead to the break with Rome, the establishment of the Church of England with Henry as its supreme head, and the dissolution of the monasteries, the greatest redistribution of wealth and property in England since the Norman conquest. All because a man needed a son. All because the Golden Prince, who had everything, was haunted by the one thing he didn't have. The cage his father built, of security, of caution, of cold financial logic, had been gilded by Henry himself. Now he was rattling the bars, trying to smash his way out, convinced that on the other side was the validation he so desperately craved. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, in the late 1520s, the king is still married to Catherine. He is growing heavier, his famous athleticism curtailed by a jousting injury to his leg that will never properly heal, leaving him in chronic pain. The Sun King is developing clouds, and a dark-eyed woman with a sharp mind and a sharper ambition is waiting in the wings, teaching him that to get what you want, you might have to break the world. But that's a storm for another night. For now, picture the two of them. Henry, his red-gold hair thinning, pacing a richly carpeted chamber, his conscience a newly discovered and wonderfully convenient tool, and Catherine, in her separate apartments, kneeling before her crucifix, her faith unshakable, her resolve iron, knowing the battle for her title, her daughter's rights, and her very soul has just begun. The family tree, so carefully grafted, is starting to splinter from within. Sleep well. So, where were we? Ah, yes, the king's great matter. Not a great matter of state, or philosophy, or war. A great matter of matrimony. A domestic dispute that would, because its participant had an army and a printing press, ripple out to reshape a nation's soul. Henry VIII, the once golden prince, now a frustrated, pain-ridden, increasingly corpulent man in his late 30s, had decided his marriage was a cosmic typo, and he wanted the universe's editor-in-chief, the Pope, to correct it. This was not a simple request. It was a multi-layered disaster of diplomacy, theology, and sheer awkwardness. Catherine of Aragon was not some minor noblewoman to be pensioned off to a nunnery. She was the aunt of the most powerful man in Europe, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, ruler of half the known world. Charles's troops had, in 1527, famously sacked Rome and were essentially holding the Pope, Clement VII, under polite house arrest. The Pope, therefore, was in no position to grant an annulment to the man whose troops were currently breathing down his neck. It would be like asking a hostage to insult his favorite aunt. Henry's initial weapon of choice in this battle was not a lawyer, but a cardinal, Thomas Wolsey, the butcher's son from Ipswich, who had risen to become the king's alter ego, the engine of the state. Wolsey was brilliant, ambitious, and lived with a magnificence that dwarfed the king's own. He was building Hampton Court, a palace so vast it was basically a city with a roof. Henry tasked him with fixing this, secure the annulment, make it happen. Wolsey tried. He convened an ecclesiastical court in England with a fancy legatine authority from the Pope to examine the case. He argued, cajoled, threatened. But Catherine was the star witness for the defense. In June 1529, she made her most stunning move. She entered the court, swept directly to Henry, fell to her knees before the entire assembly, and gave a speech in heavily accented English that was pure political theater. She appealed to him as her husband. She protested her continued virginity when she married him. She declared herself his true wife, and then she stood up, curtsied, and walked out, ignoring the calls for her to return. She never appeared in court again. She had, in one move, made the entire legal proceeding look like a cruel
Positions of influence, arguing theology with the king, exchanging passionate, manipulative love letters. He signed them Henry Rex and H seeks AB, which is somehow both grandiose and pathetic. She was making herself indispensable. And in early 1533, she also made herself pregnant. The timeline, as they say, was tight. The need for a legitimate heir suddenly had a biological deadline. Cromwell accelerated the machinery. In a dizzying sequence, in secret, Henry married Anne Boleyn. Parliament passed the Act in Restraint of Appeals, declaring England an empire subject to no foreign power like the Pope. This made the upcoming divorce an English matter. Thomas Cranmer, newly installed as Archbishop of Canterbury, convened a court. He declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void. He declared Henry's secret marriage to Anne valid. On June 1, 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England in a spectacular ceremony. The gold lettering on her canopy read, "Henry VIII with Anne Boleyn." And in September, she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. The sheer cosmic irony must have tasted like ash in Henry's mouth. All of it, the 7-year struggle, the break with 1,000 years of Christendom, the international isolation, the monstrous betrayal of a woman who had been his devoted wife for 24 years. For another daughter. The promised son was once again a no-show. Anne's position from that moment was built on sand. She was fiery, sharp-tongued, politically meddlesome, and she had failed to deliver the only thing that justified her existence. Henry, ever the romantic, began to cool. His eye, it said, began to wander at her very coronation feast. The king who had moved heaven and earth to possess her now found the possession lacking. Catherine, exiled from court, stripped of her title, and called only Princess Dowager of Wales, a title that ignored her 24 years as queen, lived out her remaining 3 years in dank, cold manners, her household reduced, her health failing. She never accepted the annulment. She signed her last letter to Henry, Catherine the Queen. She died in January 1536. Upon hearing the news, Henry and Anne, who was pregnant again, dressed in celebratory yellow. It was a ghoulish, telling display. The past was buried. Now Anne had to prove the future was male. A few days after Catherine's death, Anne miscarried. The fetus, it was reported, appeared to be a boy. The disaster was complete. Anne had not only failed to produce a living son, but she had lost the son she was carrying while her husband was openly courting one of her own ladies-in-waiting, the quiet, plain Jane Seymour. Henry, the man of grand passions, now saw Anne not as the solution, but as the problem. She was the obstacle between him and another try for a son. And Thomas Cromwell, the fixer, had a new problem to solve. Anne was now a liability. She had made enemies, powerful conservative ones who hated her religious radicalism and her sharp tongue. She had also, perhaps, been indiscreet in her frustration, laughing and flirting with the young men of her court, including her own brother, George Boleyn. What followed was one of the most efficient character assassinations and judicial murders in history. In April 1536, Cromwell engineered the arrests of Anne and 5 men, a musician, 3 courtiers, and her brother. The charges, adultery and incest. Treason, because compromising the Queen's body was compromising the succession. The trials were a foregone conclusion. The men were executed on May 17th. Anne, her spirit broken, was taken to the Tower Green on May 19th. Henry had imported a French swordsman for a cleaner cut. She made a graceful, brief speech praising the king's mercy. Then she knelt, and with one swing, it was over. She was 35 years old. The next day, Henry became formally engaged to Jane Seymour. 11 days later, they were married. So, in the span of a few months, Henry had disposed of 2 queens, one by exile and neglect, the other by the axe. One was a symbol of the old world, of duty and dynastic alliance. The other was a symbol of the new, of passion and reform. He had discarded them both with a chilling bureaucratic efficiency. The Golden King was gone.
In his place was a man who had learned that will, when combined with absolute power, could reshape reality itself, even if the reality he kept making was a lonely, blood-stained one. And in nurseries across the land, 2 daughters, Mary, the devout Catholic daughter of Catherine, and Elizabeth, the sharp-eyed toddler daughter of Anne, were learning the first and most important lesson of Tudor life. A father's love was conditional, and a mother's fate was a warning. But that's a sorrow for another night. For now, picture the scene.
So the axe had fallen. The Tower Green was scrubbed clean. The court, holding its collective breath, exhaled. And Henry, with a pragmatism that bordered on the sociopathic, simply moved on. Jane Seymour, the polar opposite of Anne. Where Anne was dark, sharp, Frenchified, and controversial, Jane was pale, placid, English, and reassuringly blank. She was the quiet after the scream. Henry, ever the master of symbolic messaging, knew exactly what he was doing. Jane represented a return to traditional values, to obedience, to a safe, docile femininity that asked for nothing and promised everything. Mainly, it promised a son. Jane Seymour was what the court called a gentlewoman, not high nobility, but good, solid stock. She had been a lady-in-waiting to both Catherine and Anne, which is a bit like serving as a staffer for 2 consecutive presidents who were impeached. She'd seen the playbook. She learned the #1 rule: do not outshine the master. Do not have opinions. Do not meddle. Be fertile, be silent, be gone if you fail. Henry married her on May 30th, 1536, a bare 11 days after Anne's head left her shoulders. There was no fanfare, no grand celebration. It was a quiet, almost furtive affair. The message was clear. This was not about passion or politics. This was about business, the business of an heir. Jane played her part perfectly. She was demure. She interceded for rebels of the Pilgrimage of Grace, not with political demands, but with a soft, wifely plea for mercy, which Henry could magnanimously grant. She restored Princess Mary to the court, a move that painted her as a peacemaker, though it came with the non-negotiable condition that Mary sign a document declaring her own parents' marriage unlawful and herself a bastard. Mary, broken by years of pressure, signed. The family drama was being ruthlessly streamlined into a corporate structure. And then, in early 1537, Jane announced she was pregnant. The collective anxiety of the entire kingdom focused on her belly. This was the 3rd queen, the 3rd try. The atmosphere was less joyous anticipation and more nervous, superstitious dread. Henry, his leg ulcerous and painful, likely prayed with a desperate intensity he hadn't felt since he was a young man trying to compose the perfect mass. The pregnancy progressed. In October, Jane took to her chambers at Hampton Court for the traditional month-long confinement. The ritual was elaborate, all candles and all female attendants, designed to ward off evil spirits. It was medieval superstition meeting Tudor desperation. On October 12th, after a long and difficult labor lasting 2 days and 3 nights, Jane Seymour gave birth to a boy, a living, screaming, healthy son. The relief was seismic. Bells rang across the country for days. Bonfires were lit. Fountains ran with wine. Henry wept. The child was named Edward, after the king's grandfather and the sainted confessor. He was instantly the most important person in England. The heir, the answer, the vindication. Henry, overjoyed, rushed to Jane's side. He thanked her, honored her. For a brief, shimmering moment, the Seymour family was ascendant. Jane had done what Catherine and Anne could not. She had delivered the prince. She was the mother of the future. And then the story does what Tudor stories do. It twists. Jane did not recover. She developed puerperal fever, an infection of the womb, the common, terrifying killer of the age. For over a week, she languished in the lavish childbed chamber, burning with fever, drifting in and out of consciousness. The finest doctors were useless. Prayers were said. On October 24th, 1537, 12 days after giving England its prince, Jane Seymour died. Henry, who had just attained his life's goal, was now a widower. The irony was thicker than the palace walls. He had his son, the precious, squalling boy who would secure the Tudor line, but the woman who gave him that son was gone. He ordered a full royal funeral, the only one of his 6 wives to receive such an honor. He wore black and mourned, genuinely, it seems. In death, Jane achieved a permanent, untouchable status she never had in life. She became the good wife, the obedient one, the one who died doing her duty. In future years, as other wives came and went in disgrace, Henry would sometimes sigh and say he wished he was back with Jane, my true wife. Death had granted her a perfection no living woman could ever hope to match. The details are murky, steeped in the gossip of enemies, but it seems there were secret meetings, perhaps during the royal progress north in the summer of 1541. Henry, blissfully unaware, was in a good mood. His leg was better, his young wife seemed cheerful. He even gave thanks at a shrine for the good life he led with her. The irony was so thick you could sculpt it. The unraveling began, as it often did, with someone who knew something and had a grudge. Mary Hall, a former servant from the dowager's household, contacted Archbishop Cranmer. Cranmer, a cautious man, didn't want to personally deliver the bombshell. He slipped a letter detailing the allegations about Catherine's past to the king during Mass on All Souls' Day. Henry, at first, refused to believe it. He ordered a quiet investigation, convinced it was slander. But investigations have a way of gaining momentum. The Howard family, sensing catastrophe, turned on their own. The Dowager Duchess raided her own houses for incriminating letters. Witnesses were interrogated, not gently. The story of Francis Dereham emerged, then the whispers about Culpeper. Jane Rochford, under pressure, broke down, providing lurid details that may have been hysterical fabrication or terrifying truth. Her mental state, after witnessing her husband's and queen's executions, was never stable. Dereham and Culpeper were arrested, tortured, and executed. Dereham was hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn. Culpeper, as a gentleman, was granted the mercy of mere beheading. Their heads adorned spikes on London Bridge. Catherine was stripped of her title and confined at Sion Abbey. The king's reaction was one of profound, self-pitying fury. He felt betrayed, humiliated, made a fool of. The rose was not only thorny, it was, in his view, a poisonous weed. He ranted about his ill luck with wives. The Lord Chancellor read out the charges to a weeping House of Lords, detailing the Queen's abominable life before and during her marriage. Parliament passed a bill of attainder against her, a neat legal trick that condemned her without a trial. She wouldn't get the dignity of a court, just a vote and a date. On February 13, 1542, Catherine Howard was taken to the Tower. She was so terrified she had to be carried to the barge. The night before her execution, she asked for the block to be brought to her room so she could practice laying her head upon it, a macabre piece of homework. The next morning, she made a short, conventional speech on the scaffold, admitting she deserved death. Then, with one stroke, the teenage queen was gone. Jane Rochford followed her to the block, driven truly mad by fear, babbling incoherently. The axe silenced her too. And so, the pattern completed itself with a brutal, savage symmetry. 2 cousins, 2 Annes and Catherines, both accused of adultery, both beheaded on the same green. The Howard Gambit had failed spectacularly at the cost of a young woman's life, tossed away as carelessly as a used handkerchief. Henry was now a 5-time widower, twice by his own command. He was morbidly obese, in constant pain, his body a map of his own excesses and anxieties. He retreated into a bitter, isolated gloom. The court became a somber, fearful place. He had his son, little Prince Edward, now a precocious, scholarly child being raised in his own separate household, a Protestant prince in the making. But the king himself was a crumbling fortress. He needed a nurse, a companion, not a passion, not a political gambit, not a rejuvenating tonic, a manager. And in 1543, he found one, Catherine Parr, a woman in her early 30s, twice widowed, intelligent, calm, and financially independent. She wasn't looking to be queen. She was in love with the rakish, reforming Thomas Seymour, brother of the late Jane. But when the king expressed interest, one did not say no. Catherine Parr was the ultimate survivor. She understood the assignment immediately. Her role was not to give him a son or to be a dazzling ornament. Her role was to soothe, to organize, to provide a semblance of domestic peace, and to keep her opinions to herself. She did this with remarkable skill. She acted as a peacemaker between Henry and his estranged daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, bringing them back to court and into a semblance of a family. She fostered a scholarly, pious atmosphere. She was the sensible stepmother in a fairy tale where the king was the ogre in the castle. But even Catherine nearly overstepped. She was, privately, a committed reformer, interested in theological debate. On a few occasions, she argued with Henry about religion. He, tetchy and dogmatic in his own self-fashioned faith, which was essentially Catholicism with him as pope, grew irritated. Her enemies, led by the conservative bishop Stephen Gardiner, saw an opening. They drew up a warrant for her arrest, citing her heretical opinions. Legend says Catherine found out and performed the performance of her life. She went to Henry, professed her utter intellectual submission, saying she only debated to distract him from his pain and to learn from his superior wisdom. She played the helpless, admiring woman. Henry, flattered and relieved, patted her cheek. "Then we are perfect friends again," he said.
Another candidate was Marie de Guise, a tall, formidable Scottish widow. She also politely declined, later marrying the King of Scots and becoming the mother of Mary, Queen of Scots. Her reported comment was even better. "I may be a tall woman, but I have a very little neck." She understood the job's occupational hazards. The rejection stung. The most powerful king in England was being turned down by widowed duchesses. It was a brutal blow to his already fragile ego. Cromwell, desperate to secure an alliance that would protect his own Protestant-leaning policies, finally landed on a candidate, Anne of Cleves, a German princess from a small, strategically important duchy. Protestant, sister to a useful ally. Holbein painted her. The portrait showed a serene, round-faced young woman with delicate features. Henry, based on the flattering image in Cromwell's eager reports, agreed to the marriage. Then she arrived in England in December 1539. It was a disaster from the moment he saw her. Henry, who liked to surprise his brides, disguised himself and barged into her chamber to present a gift. She was understandably baffled by this large, bearded stranger and barely acknowledged him. He was mortified. Later, he confided to his courtiers that he found her utterly unattractive. He infamously called her a Flanders mare. He felt he had been catfished by Holbein and Cromwell. He tried to get out of it, but the treaty was signed. The political wheels were in motion. With a spectacular lack of gallantry, he went through with the marriage on January 6, 1540. The wedding night was a catastrophe. He claimed he was unable to consummate the union. "I liked her before not well, but now I like her much worse." He found her body repulsive, and he insisted there was evidence she was not a virgin, a handy if cruel excuse. The marriage was never consummated. Anne, for her part, was probably terrified and confused, but she proved to be the smartest of them all. When Henry offered an annulment, she didn't fight. She didn't appeal to foreign powers. She agreed immediately, testifying that the marriage had never been finalized. She was rewarded with a generous settlement, houses, a huge income, the title King's beloved sister. She got to live in England, rich, independent, and free of Henry Tudor. She would outlive him and all his other wives. In the end, Anne of Cleves won the Tudor marital lottery by losing. But for Thomas Cromwell, the architect of this disaster, there was no escape. Henry's fury and humiliation needed a target. On June 10, 1540, Cromwell was arrested at a Privy Council meeting, accused of treason and heresy. No trial was needed.
He was executed on July 28th on the same spot as Anne Boleyn with a botched, gruesome axe job from a drunken executioner. Henry's most efficient servant was gone, discarded as carelessly as a used rag. And on the very same day Cromwell lost his head, Henry married his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, a teenage cousin of Anne Boleyn, pretty, giggly, flighty, and utterly out of her depth. The king, now a mountain of ailing flesh, saw in her a last spark of his vanished youth. He called her his rose without a thorn, a title he'd once given himself. It was a tragic, grotesque parody of his own golden beginning. So the pattern held. The sun was secured, but the king's heart and his judgment were now utterly adrift, pulling the kingdom into ever stranger, more dangerous waters. The family tree had its prized male shoot, but the trunk was rotting, and strange, poisonous fungi were sprouting from the bark. But that's a scandal for another night. For now, picture the scene: a cradle holding a tiny, fragile prince, a tomb holding a saintly dead queen, and a king, old before his time, dancing awkwardly with a girl young enough to be his granddaughter, trying to recapture a feeling he could no longer even name. The ledger was balanced with a life. Now the interest was coming due. Sleep well. So the king, a vast, ailing mountain of a man, married a girl who still had the dew of childhood on her, Catherine Howard. She was perhaps 17, maybe 19. The records are fuzzy, a fitting metaphor for her entire life. He was 49, but looked and felt a decade older. His leg was a suppurating horror, his girth monumental, his moods volcanic. And into this gilded sick room danced a sprightly, giggling, feather-brained teenager. She was a Howard, niece to the powerful Duke of Norfolk, cousin to the late Anne Boleyn. The Howards, ever opportunistic, saw a chance to regain influence. They polished this pretty young thing and presented her to the king as a restorative, a living, breathing tonic. And Henry, in his profound loneliness and physical misery, swallowed it. He called her his rose without a thorn, a painfully ironic echo of his own youthful nickname. He dressed her in jewels and furs, lavished attention on her, and seemed to genuinely believe her fluttering, girlish affections.
He left behind a broken church, an emptied treasury despite all the monastic wealth, and 3 children, each a living testament to a different wife, a different policy, a different Henry. A sickly boy king, Edward, the Protestant hope. An embittered, devout Catholic daughter, Mary, shaped by her mother's humiliation. A sharp, intellectually formidable daughter, Elizabeth, who had learned from her mother's ambition and her father's ruthlessness how to survive. The golden prince, the terrified accountant, the revolutionary, the tyrant, the bloated invalid, all were gone. The cage was empty, but the mechanisms of power he had built and the family drama he had authored were just winding up for their next, even more tragic act. But that's a story for a new reign. For now, picture the vast, silent bedchamber, the monstrous, still king, the quiet, efficient widow already packing her things, and somewhere in the palace 3 heirs listening to the silence, knowing their turn had come. The family tree, hacked and pruned into a strange, precarious shape, now had to bear the weight of a kingdom's future on its few fragile branches. Sleep well. The great, terrible king was gone. The chamber where he died was suddenly just a room, the air no longer thick with the threat of his temper. What he left behind was less a throne and more a complicated piece of financial and theological machinery, currently sized for an adult, now to be operated by a child. Edward VI was 9 years old, a slight, fair, serious boy with his father's red-gold hair and his mother's pale delicacy. He had been raised in a virtual bubble, a sterile nursery for the sole heir. His tutors, like the brilliant John Cheek, had filled his mind with the clean, logical strains of Renaissance humanism and the fierce, stripped-down doctrines of Protestant reform. He was a prodigy. He wrote essays in Greek,
debated theology and Latin, and understood the mechanics of kingship as an intellectual exercise. What he lacked was any experience of the messy, grubby, emotional world his father had ruled through fear and will. Edward was a prince of the mind, inheriting a kingdom of the gut. The will Henry left was a masterpiece of paranoid contingency planning. Edward was king, but if Edward died without heirs, the crown would pass to Mary, then to Elizabeth. Both women, however, were still legally bastardized. It was a Henry-style move, giving with one hand while undermining with the other. He also established a council of regency, 16 men who were supposed to rule collectively until Edward turned 18. This was a king who trusted no single person, not even in death. The collective bit lasted about 5 minutes. Edward's uncle, Edward Seymour, Jane Seymour's brother, swiftly emerged as the top dog. He had himself named Lord Protector of the Realm and Duke of Somerset. He was the boy king's Protestant uncle, a military man with a reputation for moderate reform and a rather high opinion of his own benevolence. He moved the young king into his own household, essentially taking custody of the royal person, which was the ultimate bargaining chip. Somerset's rule was a mix of high-minded idealism and catastrophic incompetence. He genuinely wanted to help the poor. He launched inquiries into enclosure, the practice of fencing off common land for sheep, which was impoverished.
But there was a problem growing in the center of their plans. Edward was sickly. He had always been delicate, but in 1552 he contracted what was probably tuberculosis. He began to waste away. The fair prince became a ghost. Coughing fits racked his thin frame. The future of their entire Protestant project, a project built entirely on the life of this one boy, was vanishing before their eyes. The succession, as per Henry's will, was clear. Edward, then Mary, then Elizabeth. Mary was a devout, stubborn, middle-aged Catholic. If she came to the throne, she would undo everything Edward and Northumberland had built. She would bring back the Pope, the Mass, the monasteries. It would be a catastrophe for the reformers and likely a death sentence for Northumberland. So they hatched a plan, a desperate, illegal, and utterly ruthless plan. They would change the succession. Edward, dying but still fiercely committed to his faith, was persuaded. He drew up a document, My Devise for the Succession. He bypassed his half-sisters, both legally bastardized, and the other, Mary, a Catholic. He also bypassed the Scottish line descending from his aunt Margaret. Instead, he left the crown to his Protestant cousin once removed, Lady Jane Grey. More precisely, he left it to the heirs male of Jane Grey, and if she had none by the time of his death, then to her directly. It was a piece of theological Sudoku designed to keep a Protestant on the throne. Jane Grey was an interesting choice. She was 16, ferociously intelligent, a scholar of Greek and Calvinist theology, and utterly uninterested in being queen. She was a bookworm, happiest with her tutors. She was also Northumberland's daughter-in-law, having recently been married to his son, Guilford Dudley. This was not a coincidence. Northumberland was securing his family's future as the power behind a puppet queen. Edward VI died on July 6, 1553, at the age of 15. He died praying, they said, for the survival of the Protestant faith. His last words were a whispered, "I am faint. Lord, have mercy upon me, and take my spirit." It was a quiet, sad end for a boy who had been a symbol since birth, a prince who never got to be a person. Northumberland kept the death secret for 3 days, just as they had with Henry. He secured the tower, the treasury, and Jane Grey. He then announced both the king's death and the new queen's accession. Jane Grey was taken to the tower not as a prisoner, but as a monarch. She famously protested, wept, and fainted when told she was queen. She accepted it only as a divine duty. Her reign would last 9 days. Because while Northumberland had the capital,
the bureaucracy, and the legal document, he had forgotten one thing: the people's sense of legitimacy. Mary Tudor, down in Norfolk, was Henry VIII's daughter. She was 37. In an age where that was solidly middle-aged, she looked older. A life of stress, ill health, and profound humiliation will do that. She was small, thin, with her red-gold hair faded to a sandy gray, and myopic eyes that squinted at a world that had for most of her life been very unkind. Her voice, famously, was deep and mannish, a fact her enemies never let her forget. But she had something her opponents fatally underestimated: an unshakable certainty and the righteous fury of a wronged heir.
Her triumph was initially a stunning popular revolution. The country, confused by rapid religious change, rallied to the principle of blood. She was Henry's daughter, the legitimate one in the eyes of many. As she marched on London, crowds cheered. The council, those same men who had days before proclaimed Jane Grey queen, fell over themselves to swear loyalty. Northumberland, from the scaffold, renounced Protestantism in a desperate bid for mercy. It didn't work. He died, and his son, Guilford Dudley, would wait in the Tower, a living warrant against his wife, the 9-day queen. Mary entered London in August 1553 to ringing bells and pageants. It must have been a profoundly vindicating and utterly surreal moment. The princess who had been declared a bastard, forced to sign papers denying her own mother's marriage, hidden away in obscure manners, was now queen. Her first act was to have a requiem mass sung for her brother's soul in the Tower. The Latin chant, banned for years, echoed off the stones. It was a declaration: the past was back. But what past? Mary's ideal was not her father's complex, nationalistic Catholicism. It was her mother's world, the universal Catholic Church, obedient to Rome, sacramentally rich, doctrinally pure. She wanted a full restoration. And she wanted an heir, a Catholic heir, to secure that restoration forever. These two desires, the public and the profoundly personal, would become fatally intertwined, driving her reign toward its tragic, brutal conclusion. First, the heir required a husband. Mary's choice was telling. She could have picked an English noble, securing her throne domestically. She chose instead Philip of Spain, son of the Emperor Charles V, her powerful cousin. It was a choice of the heart. She seems to have fallen for his portrait and the idea of him, and of ideology, the champion of global Catholicism. To her, it was a glorious union. To her subjects, it looked like selling the nation to a foreign power. Parliament, with surprising backbone, begged her to reconsider. There were rebellions, like Wyatt's rebellion in 1554, explicitly aimed at stopping the marriage. She crushed it with steely resolve. Lady Jane Grey, who had remained a prisoner in the Tower, now became a political liability. Jane, the innocent pawn, and her young husband, Guilford Dudley, were executed. Mary, the once persecuted princess, signed the death warrant of a 16-year-old cousin who never wanted the crown. The first seeds of her future nickname were sown. She married Philip in the summer of 1554. He was 26, handsome, polished, and politically astute. He found her devout, earnest, and utterly unattractive. He performed his marital duties with Habsburg efficiency and spent as much time out of the country as possible. But Mary was euphoric. By the end of the year, she was convinced she was pregnant. Her belly swelled. She felt movements. The physicians agreed. Te Deums were sung. The future was secured. Months passed. The due date came and went, then another. The pregnancy was a phantom, a cruel trick of her own desperate body and mind, perhaps a uterine tumor, perhaps advanced dropsy, perhaps sheer hysterical wish fulfillment. The humiliation was catastrophic, public, and complete.
Philip, who had stuck around for the heir, left soon after, his diplomatic duties in the Netherlands suddenly requiring his urgent presence. He would rarely return. The personal tragedy curdled into public policy. If God was denying her a child, she reasoned, it must be because England was not yet worthy. The heresy in the land was provoking his wrath, and so the restoration of the faith shifted from persuasion to persecution. The statutes against heresy were revived. The burnings began. They started with clerics, Bishops Latimer and Ridley, who were burned at the stake in Oxford. Then came Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, the architect of her parents' divorce, the man who had declared her a bastard. He first signed a recantation, then, in a stunning moment of redemption at his execution, thrust the hand that had signed the paper into the fire first, declaring it had offended. His death was a propaganda disaster for Mary. The horror was visceral. The burnings continued. Nearly 300 men and women, from weavers to gentlewomen, were burned at the stake in just over 4 years. They were not powerful politicians. They were ordinary people who, with simple, stubborn faith, refused to renounce the Protestant beliefs they'd learned under Edward. She saw it as surgery, cutting out a cancerous heresy to save the body politic. The country saw smoke and smelled charred flesh. The nickname coalesced, Bloody Mary. Her marriage was a barren, lonely affair. Philip found her tedious. Her phantom pregnancies repeated, each one a fresh cycle of hope and crushing, mocking despair. Her health, which never was good, deteriorated. She was often ill, plagued by headaches and what may have been ovarian cysts or uterine cancer. The vibrant, determined woman of 1553.
As she died, her counselors were already slipping away to Hatfield, to her sister Elizabeth. The quiet, studious, red-haired woman who had watched and learned from the wings was now the only option left. The Catholic Restoration died with Mary. The Tudor line, so desperate for a son, now depended on the 2 daughters it had once spurned. So, picture the scene. A dim, incense-heavy chamber. A small, wasted woman, her dreams turned to ash, literal and figurative. The sound of Latin chant fading into a death rattle. And in a sunlit house not far away, a 25-year-old woman is told she is queen. She sinks to her knees, quotes a psalm in Latin, and begins, instantly, to calculate. The family tree, after all the storms of fire and blood, has one last, unexpected, and most resilient branch left to bear the weight of a crown. But that's a glittering, complicated dawn for another night. For now, just the echo of a requiem and the cold, empty space where a child was meant to be. Sleep well. The requiem faded. The incense smoke dissipated. In the cold quiet of St. James's Palace, a world ended. And in a sun-dappled garden at Hatfield House, a new one was being assembled, piece by careful piece, by a woman who had been practicing for this moment her entire life. Elizabeth Tudor was 25. She had her father's red hair, her mother's dark, penetrating eyes, and a mind that was entirely her own, a library of survival strategies written in the margins of near disaster. She had been a bastard, a prisoner, a suspect, a survivor. Now they told her she was queen. The story goes she sank to her knees under an oak tree and quoted the 118th Psalm in Latin. Ad Domino factum est istud et est mirabile in oculis nostris. This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. It was the perfect blend of piety and political theater. She knew the performance had already begun. Her inheritance was a masterclass in dysfunction. The treasury was empty, thanks to war and mismanagement. The country was religiously torn, with hardline Catholics and radical Protestants eyeing each other across a landscape of charred stakes. England was a laughingstock in Europe, having lost its last French territory, and the throne itself was viewed by most Catholic powers as illegitimate, occupied by the heretical, bastard daughter of an executed adulteress. It was not a promising start. Elizabeth's first and most brilliant move was to not move too quickly. Where Mary had rushed to restore the past, Elizabeth cultivated ambiguity. She kept her private Catholic chapel for a time, while making it clear Protestant services would be public. She appointed as her key advisor William Cecil, a man of Protestant leanings, but more importantly, a man of caution, detail, and infinite patience. Their partnership would become the engine of the reign. The Queen's intuition and political genius filtered through Cecil's meticulous, bureaucratic mind. The first great question, the one that would echo for decades, was announced at her very first parliament: marriage. She must marry. She must produce an heir. The stability of the realm demanded it. Elizabeth, with a smile that was already becoming famous for what it concealed, gave an answer that was a masterpiece of political evasion. She produced a ring. She declared herself already married to England. Her coronation ring was her wedding band. It was romantic. It was defiant. It was utterly, gloriously impractical. And it set the tone. She would keep everyone guessing, suitors, parliament, foreign ambassadors, for the next 30 years. The marriage game became her greatest diplomatic weapon, a perpetual dance of maybe that kept France, Spain, and the Habsburgs off balance. But that one man was not just a pawn on the chessboard. Robert Dudley, the son of the executed Duke of Northumberland, the brother of Guildford Dudley, husband to the executed Jane Grey. He and Elizabeth had known each other since childhood, prisoners together in the Tower during Mary's reign. He was handsome, athletic, charming, and deeply personally devoted to her. When she made him master of the horse, giving him constant, intimate access, the court gossiped. Then, in 1560, his wife, Amy Robsart, was found dead at the bottom of a staircase with a broken neck at their country house. It was likely an accident. She was ill, possibly with breast cancer, and fell. But the scandal was nuclear. It smelled of murder. It made marriage to Dudley impossible. Whether they were lovers in fact is one of history's great unanswered questions, but they were lovers in spirit, in political partnership, in a deep, complicated bond that lasted until his death. He would be her eyes, her favorite, the only man who could make the imperious queen laugh with genuine, unguarded delight, and she could never marry him. While Elizabeth managed her personal myth, a more dangerous shadow was taking shape north of the border. Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin one removed, a Catholic, the granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister Margaret. By the logic of primogeniture ignored by Henry's will, Mary had a stronger claim to the English throne than Elizabeth did. She was young, beautiful, charismatic, and viewed by Catholic Europe as the rightful queen of England. She was everything Elizabeth wasn't: overtly feminine, openly emotional, romantically reckless. Mary's life was a Tudor tragedy and fast forward. Married to the young, sickly French king Francis II, she was briefly Queen of France. Widowed at 18, she returned to Scotland, a kingdom she barely knew, riven by Protestant lords and a fiery preacher named John Knox, who thought female rule was an abomination. She married her cousin, the handsome, useless Lord Darnley,
who had his own claim to the English throne. She had a son, James. Then Darnley was murdered in an explosion, and Mary promptly married the man widely believed to have orchestrated it, the Earl of Bothwell. The Scottish lords rebelled. She was forced to abdicate in favor of her one-year-old son. In 1568, she fled across the border into England, throwing herself on Elizabeth's mercy. It was the ultimate political hot potato. Mary was a deposed, anointed queen, a relative, and a Catholic figurehead. To let her go to France or Spain would be to unleash a rallying point for invasion. To restore her to Scotland was impossible. To keep her was to host a live grenade at the heart of the realm. Elizabeth did what she did best. She postponed. Mary was placed under a comfortable but very strict house arrest.
for the next 19 years. Mary's presence became the focal point for every Catholic plot against Elizabeth. The Ridolfi plot, the Throckmorton plot, the Babington plot. Each one aimed to assassinate Elizabeth, raise a Catholic rebellion, and place Mary on the throne. Cecil and Elizabeth's spymaster, Francis Walsingham, a man so Puritan he seemed to exhale frost, built a formidable intelligence network. They intercepted letters, turned conspirators, and slowly, meticulously built a case. Elizabeth was trapped. She hated the idea of executing an anointed queen. It set a terrible precedent. "We princes are set on stages," she said, "in the sight and view of all the world." To kill a fellow monarch was to break a sacred club's rules. But as plot after plot was uncovered, the pressure from her council, from Parliament, became immense. Mary, for her part, played her role with a doomed regal carelessness, corresponding with plotters in ciphered letters smuggled in beer barrels, never quite admitting guilt, but never discouraging her rescuers either. Finally, after the Babington plot in 1586, the evidence was undeniable. Mary was tried and convicted. Parliament demanded her head. Elizabeth prevaricated. She signed the death warrant, then claimed she didn't mean it to be sent. Cecil and the council, knowing her habits, sent it anyway. On February 8, 1587, at Fotheringhay Castle, Mary, Queen of Scots, was beheaded. It took 3 blows of the axe. When the executioner held up her head, the auburn wig came off in his hand, revealing close-cropped gray hair. She was 44. When the news was brought to Elizabeth, her fury at her council was reportedly epic and almost certainly partly performative. She needed to be seen as the reluctant author of a necessary evil. But the deed was done. The shadow was gone. And it freed Philip II of Spain, Mary's brother-in-law and former husband of Bloody Mary, to act. No longer needing to place Mary on the throne, he could now claim England for himself. The enterprise of England was launched. The Armada. The year 1588 is the glittering peak of the Elizabethan myth. The vast Spanish fleet, the invincible Armada, sailing up the Channel. The smaller, nimbler English ships harrying them. The fire ships sent into Calais harbor. The Protestant wind that scattered the Spanish ships north around Scotland and Ireland, where they were wrecked by storms. Elizabeth, wearing a silver breastplate over a white gown, addressing her troops at Tilbury. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." It was the ultimate performance, and it worked. England was saved. The legend of Gloriana was cemented. But after the zenith comes the long, slow decline. The 1590s were difficult. The great weather of her prosperity, as one observer called it, broke. The war with Spain dragged on, ruinously expensive. Harvests failed. Poverty and unrest grew. Her closest circle began to die. Robert Dudley, her eyes, died in 1588, just after the Armada. She locked herself in her room for days. William Cecil died in 1998. His son Robert took his place, clever but colder. The brilliant courtiers of the early reign, Leicester, Walsingham, Sir Christopher Hatton, were gone. A new, greedier generation jostled for favor. The Earl of Essex, Robert Devereux, Dudley's stepson, a handsome, petulant, overgrown boy who reminded her of his stepfather's youth but lacked his political sense. Essex's disastrous military command in Ireland, his botched rebellion in 1501, and his subsequent execution broke something in her. The man who had burst into her bedroom unannounced, who had turned his back on her in a fit of pique, was gone. The personal loss was layered onto the national gloom. She was old. Her red hair was a wig. Her teeth were black. Her face, coated in lead-based white makeup, was a cracked porcelain mask. She moved between her palaces, the rituals of court continuing like a play whose audience had dwindled. She refused to name a successor, though everyone knew it would be James VI of Scotland, Mary's son. To name him was to acknowledge the end. In early 2003, at Richmond Palace, she fell into a settled and unremovable melancholy. She refused food, refused to go to bed, stood for hours on end in her privy chamber, staring into the fire. Perhaps it was depression, perhaps illness. Finally, she took to bed. When asked to name her successor, she is said to have made a sign, a circle around her head with her finger, indicating a crown. James. It was done. She died in the early mornings of March 24th, 1603. The Tudor line, born from the anxious calculations of a banker king, died with her. It had produced giants and monsters, reformers and tyrants, a gallery of brilliant, flawed, desperate personalities. It had broken from Rome, executed queens, seen boy kings and bloody queens, and ended with a virgin who had turned her own childlessness into a potent, lasting symbol of national sovereignty. The family tree, after a century of furious, vibrant, brutal growth, was now a fossil. A new dynasty from Scotland would inherit the throne, and the problems, and the legend. Elizabeth's greatest achievement was perhaps the myth she wove around herself, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, a creature of pure symbol, so powerful that it obscured the lonely, shrewd, often frightened woman who had outlived them all, and in doing so had defined an age. So we end where we began, with a whisper. Not Odin's whisper of secret knowledge to a dead son, but the whisper of a woman to herself in a mirror as she painted on the face of a king. A whisper of calculation, of control, of survival. The Tudor epic closes not with a bang or a battle, but with the soft closing of a jewelry box, the final piece of a magnificent, gaudy, and terribly human collection, locked away for history to marvel at. Sleep well. The tree is now silent. The story is told. And so the great Tudor clockwork runs down. The last golden wheel stops. The silence that follows in the palaces is not just the absence of one old woman's breath, but the end of a rhythm, a heartbeat that had been, for good or ill, the pulse of England for 118 years. They take the ring from her finger, the coronation ring she said was her wedding band, fused to her flesh so long they have to file it off. A fittingly stubborn corporal end to a reign built on symbols. The courtiers, their eyes already darting north to Scotland, pack up the myth. They will call it a golden age. They will speak of Gloriana, of the Virgin Queen, of the defeat of the Armada, and the plays of Shakespeare. They will gloss over the burned Catholics, the executed cousins, the starving poor, the desperate, lonely woman in the lead-painted mask. History, like a good jeweler, will set the best stones face up. But we are not quite done with family trees, not yet. Because if the Tudors teach us anything, it is that no dynasty exists in a vacuum. They are reactions to what came before, and they become the ghosts that haunt what comes after. The Stuarts, waiting in Edinburgh, are a perfect case study. James VI of Scotland, now James I of England, the son of the executed Mary, the great-great-grandson of the first Tudor Henry, inherits not just a crown, but a sackful of Tudor baggage. The divine right of kings, which the Tudors practiced with such ruthless realpolitik, he will preach with tedious theoretical dogma. The religious settlement Elizabeth fudged with such brilliant ambiguity, he will try to codify, sparking the gunpowder plot. The frugal treasury she somehow kept mostly afloat, he will drain with spectacular incompetence. He is, in many ways, the tragic punchline to the Tudor joke, a theorist inheriting the legacy of practitioners. But that's a story for another dynasty, another deep dive into the strange soil of hereditary power. We began this long journey in the roots of a world tree, with a god who sacrificed himself to himself for wisdom he could not change. We ended in a palace, with a queen who sacrificed the possibility of a private self to craft a public image that would define a nation. Both stories are about the price of knowledge and the burden of rule. Both are about cycles, of prophecy, of violence, of rebirth. Both are about families, the Aesir, bound by oaths and betrayals, the Tudors, bound by blood and the axe. The through line, perhaps, is the quiet, desperate individual at the center of the maelstrom. Odin on his tree, Henry VII in his counting house,
Elizabeth before her mirror. The scale is different, cosmic, national, personal, but the vibration is the same. A hum of profound loneliness, the isolation of the one who is supposed to know, to decide, to secure. So, if you've stayed with me through the hanging god and the haunting of the Habsburg jaw, through the Ledger King and the 9-day Queen, through the burning gorse and the Virgin's ring, thank you. This particular tapestry is complete. The threads are cut. But the loom of history is never still. Other patterns, just as intricate, just as flawed, wait in the warp and weft. Perhaps next time we could drift east to a court even more insular, autocratic, more trapped in its own mythos than the Tudors ever were. To a family whose isolation would become their pathology, and whose end would be not a slow fading, but a sudden violent erasure in a cellar in Yekaterinburg. The Romanovs offer a different kind of twilight, one not of a dynasty fizzling out, but one shattering against the gears of a world it refused to understand. But that's a story for another dynasty, another deep dive into the strange soil of hereditary power. We began this long journey in the roots of a world tree, with a god who sacrificed himself to himself for wisdom he could not change. We ended in a palace, with a queen who sacrificed the possibility of a private self to craft a public image that would define a nation. Both stories are about the price of knowledge and the burden of rule. Both are about cycles, of prophecy, of violence, of rebirth. Both are about families, the Aesir, bound by oaths and betrayals, the Tudors, bound by blood and the axe. The through line, perhaps, is the quiet, desperate individual at the center of the maelstrom. Odin on his tree, Henry VII in his counting house, Elizabeth before her mirror. The scale is different, cosmic, national, personal, but the vibration is the same. A hum of profound loneliness, the isolation of the one who is supposed to know, to decide, to secure. So, if you've stayed with me through the hanging god and the haunting of the Habsburg jaw, through the Ledger King and the 9-day Queen, through the burning gorse and the Virgin's ring, thank you. This particular tapestry is complete. The threads are cut.
Sleep well. The history is never finished, but the storyteller, for now, is done. Welcome back. The air has changed again. The damp wood smoke scent of Tudor England dissipates, replaced by something colder, sharper. The smell of snow, of pine resin, of vast distances, and of a slow-burning, incense-heavy orthodoxy. We've traveled east, to a realm where the sun sets later, the winters last longer, and the scale of everything, ambition, tyranny, suffering, and the land itself, feels exaggerated. We have left the island drama for a continental epic. Tonight, we drift into the heart of Russia, and to the dynasty that would come to embody its contradictions, its mysticism, and its tragic destiny, the Romanovs. Our story doesn't begin with them, of course. Dynasties rarely do. They begin in the chaos left by others, the time of troubles, a period following the death of Ivan the Terrible, a nickname that, for once, is not an exaggeration, where famine, civil war, and Polish invasion reduced Russia to a bleeding half-corpse of a state. The throne was a game of musical chairs played with daggers. Pretenders, called false Dimitris, popped up with alarming frequency. It was, in short, a mess. Out of this anarchy, in 1613, a national assembly, the Zemsky Sobor, was desperate for stability. They needed a candidate with a vague connection to the old Rurik dynasty, but one who was weak enough to be controlled, innocent enough to be untainted by recent horrors. Their gaze fell on a 16-year-old boy, Mikhail Romanov.
Mikhail was hiding in a monastery with his mother, terrified. His father, Fyodor Romanov, was a powerful churchman and political player, currently languishing in a Polish prison. His family was connected to the old Tsars through marriage. His great-aunt was Anastasia Romanovna, Ivan the Terrible's beloved first wife. It was a thin thread, but it was enough. The delegates found him, pleaded with him, and basically dragged the terrified teenager to Moscow to be crowned Tsar Mikhail I. He was not a figure of power. He was a symbol of exhaustion, a plea for quiet. For the first years, he ruled through his dominating mother, and upon his return from captivity, his formidable father, Patriarch Filarat, who became the true power behind the throne, a sort of priest-king regent. The Romanov saga begins not with a bang, but with a resigned sigh. A dynasty founded on collective trauma and the desperate hope that a quiet boy wouldn't make things worse. And for a while, they didn't. The early Romanovs were administrators. They healed the wounds. They made peace. They slowly pushed the Poles back. They were the careful gardeners after a fire, tending the first green shoots. It was necessary, dull work, and it lasted for generations. The old Muscovy seeped into the dynasty. It was a world of intense, almost suffocating ritual. The Tsar was a semi-divine figure, hidden away in the Kremlin's terem, the women's quarters, seen only on prescribed occasions, moving in a cloud of incense and Byzantine ceremony. Russia turned inward, suspicious of the West, defining itself by its unique orthodoxy and its vast, incomprehensible geography. The Romanovs became the caretakers of this isolated, mystical kingdom. Then, a comet arrived. Not a celestial one, though it would have been fitting, a human comet. A giant, nearly 7 feet tall, with a bottomless appetite for work, for war, for drink, and for a new vision of what Russia could be. Peter Alexeyevich Romanov, Peter the Great. He was a product of the old world's chaos. His father, Tsar Alexis, had been a pious, traditional ruler. The court was a nest of rivalries between his mother's family, the Milosavskis, and his father's second wife's family, the Narishkins, Peter's side. When Alexis died, there was a bloody struggle. Peter, a boy of 10, witnessed the Streltsy, the musketeer guards, storm the Kremlin, murdering his mother's supporters and hacking his uncle to pieces before his eyes. The trauma marked him. It also gave him a lifelong, visceral hatred for the old Muscovite ways, which he saw as backward, superstitious, and violent. He grew up not in the stifling Kremlin, but in the German quarter outside Moscow, where European engineers, soldiers, and doctors lived. He played with real cannon. He built mock forts and fought mock battles with real casualties. He was fascinated by ships, a nonsensical passion in a landlocked, forested empire. He was a force of nature in a boy's body, crude, curious, and terrifyingly energetic. When he finally seized power in his own right, he didn't just reform Russia, he attempted to break it over his knee and rebuild it in the image of the West he admired. He traveled incognito through Europe, working in shipyards. He forced his nobles to shave their beards, a sacrilegious act to the Orthodox, who believed beards brought you closer to God. He built a new capital from the swampy, malaria-ridden marshes of the Neva River Delta. St. Peter
For treason. Alexei died in prison, likely from the torture. Peter had effectively murdered his own son for the future of his vision. He was a giant who straddled 2 worlds. He dragged Russia kicking and screaming into the 18th century, giving it a navy, an academy of sciences, a modernized army. But he also cemented the absolute power of the autocrat, the subjugation of the serfs, and the idea that the state was a project to be built regardless of the human cost. He left a transformed, exhausted, and deeply conflicted empire, and a succession crisis. For the next 70 years after Peter's death in 1725, the Romanov throne became a prize for palace guards and shadowy committees. It was the era of the women. Catherine I, Peter's peasant wife, ruled briefly.
Then Anna, a bitter, petty duchess from Courland, who brought her Baltic German favorite, Biron, and a period of vicious, small-minded repression. Then Elizabeth, Peter's daughter, a beautiful, lazy, and devout hedonist who loved parties, fashion, and never signed a death warrant, but who also drained the treasury funding her lavish lifestyle and the 7 Years' War. It was a carnival of instability. Emperors and empresses rose and fell like actors in a poorly managed repertory theater. The Romanov bloodline thinned, diluted by German marriages arranged for diplomatic convenience. The court spoke French, looked to Paris, and drifted further from the vast, silent, suffering Russian countryside it ruled. And then, in 1762, another coup. This one brought to power a woman who was not a Romanov by blood at all, but by marriage, a minor German princess from Anhalt-Zerbst named Sophie, who reinvented herself as Catherine. History would call her the Great. But that's a story of ambition, enlightenment, passion, and iron will for another night. For now, picture the beginning. A terrified boy in a monastery hearing the footsteps of delegates coming to offer him a crown he never wanted. The dynasty that would define Russia for 3 centuries starts not with a conqueror's shout, but with a whisper of consent from a child who just wanted the chaos to stop. The wheel was set in motion. It would roll through ice and fire, through brilliance and madness, all the way to a dark cellar in the Ural Mountains. But we have a long, glittering, and often grotesque road to travel before we get there. Settle in. The Russian winter is long, and the stories are dark, ornate, and full of strange, compelling ghosts. Sleep well. The Romanov dynasty, after Peter the Great, was like a carriage careening down a mountain road with no one firmly holding the reins. Drivers swapped in and out, a peasant wife, a bitter niece, a party-loving daughter. The horses, the vast, unruly Russian Empire, galloped on, but the direction was chaotic, the interior lavish and unstable. Then, in 1762, a new driver seized the reins, not a Romanov by blood, but perhaps the most Romanov in spirit since Peter himself, a shrewd, ambitious, intellectually voracious German princess who had spent 18 years in a miserable marriage waiting for her moment. Catherine Alexeyevna, Catherine the Great. Her story begins as a lesson in survival. Born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, she was brought to Russia at 14 as a prospective bride for the heir to the throne, her cousin, Grand Duke Peter. From the start, it was a mismatch of soul-crushing proportions. Sophie, who reinvented herself as Catherine, a more Russian name, was intelligent, curious, and desperate to belong. She learned the language, converted to orthodoxy with a display of fervent memorization that impressed the court, and read everything she could: Montesquieu, Voltaire, the Enlightenment philosophers. Her husband, the future Peter III, was a historical punchline in the making. A devoted admirer of Frederick the Great of Prussia, he played with toy soldiers, had the temper of a spoiled child, and openly despised Russia, its church, and its people. He was, by all accounts, an immature, unpleasant fool. Their marriage was a desert of loneliness and humiliation. She endured his neglect and public insults. She gave birth to an heir, Paul, whose paternity was widely speculated to be not Peter's, but that of her first lover, Sergei Saltykov. It didn't matter. The dynasty needed a child. She played the long game. She cultivated friendships with powerful guards officers like the handsome and loyal Grigory Orlov and his brothers. She built a network. She read Machiavelli. She waited. Peter finally became emperor in 1762. His reign lasted 6 months. In that time, he managed to alienate virtually every power bloc in Russia. He ended the war with Prussia, saving his idol Frederick from certain defeat, which infuriated the military. He attacked the Orthodox Church. He was erratic, drunk, and publicly cruel to Catherine. He threatened to divorce her, imprison her, and marry his mistress. Catherine's moment came in June. While Peter was at a holiday resort, she was woken early in the morning by one of the Orlov brothers.
The time was now. Dressed in a simple guards officer's uniform, she rode to the barracks of the Izmailovsky regiment, where she gave a speech asking the soldiers to protect her from her husband's plot to kill her. They swore allegiance. Other regiments followed. The powerful church hierarchy backed her. The coup was bloodless, astonishingly efficient. Peter III, deposed, was taken to a palace in the countryside. A week later, he was dead, officially of hemorrhoidal colic. In reality, almost certainly murdered by Alexei.
Orlov, Grigory's brother. Catherine's hands were clean, but the stain was there. She had ascended over her husband's corpse. And so began a reign that would last 34 years. Catherine presented herself as the enlightened successor to Peter the Great's westernizing mission. She corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot, calling herself their pupil. She drafted a grand legal code, the Nakaz, filled with enlightened principles about justice, equality before the law, and the evils of torture. She convened a legislative commission to modernize Russia's laws. It was a dazzling intellectual performance. But the performance met reality. The commission, a talking shop of nobles, townspeople, and others, achieved nothing. The Nakaz's radical ideas were quietly shelved. For all her talk of enlightenment, Catherine was, above all, a pragmatist. Her power rested on the support of the nobility, and she would not undermine them. In fact, she cemented their power. After a massive peasant rebellion led by the Cossack Emelian Pugachev, a revolt that shook the empire to its core, Catherine responded by tightening the screws. Serfdom, the foundation of the Russian economy, was extended and intensified. The nobility's grip over their human property became absolute. The enlightened empress became the great enslaver. This was the central, glaring contradiction of Catherine, the philosopher on the throne, whose reign saw the golden age of the Russian nobility and the darkest age of the Russian serf. She built schools for the elite, founded the Hermitage Museum, and supported the arts. Meanwhile, the vast majority of her subjects lived in a state of legal bondage worse than ever. She spoke of liberty, while granting her favorites vast estates with thousands of souls, a chillingly accurate term. Her personal life was as politically charged as her policies. She had a series of official favorites, young, handsome men who rose to dizzying heights through her affection. Grigory Orlov, who helped with the coup. Grigory Potemkin, perhaps the love of her life, a massive, one-eyed, brilliant, erratic genius who became her de facto co-ruler, overseeing the colonization of the South, the building of the Black Sea Fleet, and the annexation of Crimea. Their relationship was a unique blend of romance and political partnership. Even after their intimate relationship ended, they remained the closest of allies. His notes to her signed, "Your faithful, devoted, grateful, and loving slave." He was the only man who could match her in scale of vision. Later favorites were younger, less substantial, kept for companionship and to stave off loneliness. She was famously pragmatic about it. These relationships were not hidden scandals. They were an open part of the court structure, with the favorite receiving palaces, titles, and wealth. It was a system. Under her rule, Russia expanded dramatically. She partitioned Poland, wiping a historic kingdom off the map in concert with Prussia and Austria. She fought successful wars against the Ottoman Empire, gaining the vital warm water ports Peter the Great had dreamed of. She pushed the borders south and west. Russia became a European superpower, feared and respected. St. Petersburg blossomed into a breathtaking imperial capital, a testament to her will and her love for European culture. But the glitter of the court, the intellectual salons, the grand military parades, all rested on a foundation of profound human misery. The Pugachev rebellion had been a terrifying glimpse into the abyss of popular rage. Catherine,
But that's a tension for the 19th century to unravel. For now, the empire rests under the shadow of a double-headed eagle whose gaze, thanks to Catherine, now looked firmly both east and west. The Winter Palace is splendid, the court speaks French, and the night is cold, clear and deceptively still. Sleep well. Catherine the Great died, and the mechanism of the state, so carefully wound by her will, shuddered and changed hands. It passed to a man who was, in every conceivable way, her psychological opposite, Paul I, her son. The ghost at the feast, the living reminder of the coup and the corpse in Rapture. If Catherine was enlightenment and expansion, Paul was reaction and rigid paranoia. He spent his mother's long reign in bitter, powerless exile from court, marinating in resentment. He idealized his murdered father, Peter III, and despised everything Catherine represented. His reign was a 4-year tantrum of reversed policies. He returned to the Prussian military models she hated, imposing brutal, pointless drill on the army. He repealed the law she'd passed freeing nobles from compulsory state service, trying to drag them back into the 18th century. He was capricious, volatile, and widely hated. He also built a fortress, the Mikhailovsky Castle in St. Petersburg, a dank, moated, medieval-looking thing, far from the elegant Winter Palace. He moved in, obsessed with security, convinced of plots. The irony was exquisite. In March 1801, just 40 nights after moving into his secure fortress, a group of disgruntled guards officers and nobles, likely with the tacit approval of his own son and heir, Alexander, broke into his bedroom. They demanded his abdication. A struggle ensued. He was struck, strangled, and smothered with a scarf. The autocrat, who feared assassination, was murdered in the heart of his own paranoid sanctuary. The Romanov tradition of violent succession was alive and well. And so the throne passed to the grandson, Alexander I, the beautiful, enigmatic, melancholic Alexander. Raised by his grandmother Catherine to be the perfect enlightened monarch, but scarred by his father's murder, which he may have foreseen and did nothing to prevent, his soul became a battlefield between liberal idealism and mystical autocracy. He began with hope, talk of constitutions, of reforms, of ending serfdom. He surrounded himself with a secret committee of young progressive friends. And then nothing much happened. The weight of Russia, the inertia of the system was too great. Instead of domestic transformation, history offered him a grand external stage, Napoleon. The Napoleonic Wars made Alexander's reputation. He was the rock upon which the Corsican's empire broke. He refused to make a separate peace after the disaster at Austerlitz. He met Napoleon on a raft at Tilsit, a moment of dazzling personal diplomacy that split Europe between them. Then, when Napoleon invaded Russia in 2012, Alexander adopted a stance of serene, stubborn defiance. He refused to negotiate, even as Moscow burned. "I would let my beard grow and eat potatoes with the meanest of my peasants before I signed the disgrace of my country," he said. It was the performance of a lifetime. The retreat of the Grande Armée, destroyed by winter and Russian tenacity, made Alexander the savior of Europe. He rode into Paris at the head of the coalition armies in 1814, the handsome, blonde Tsar, the angel of deliverance. He was at the zenith of his power, the arbiter of the continent, and it broke something in him. The experience plunged him into a deep, mystical Christianity. He fell under the influence of religious zealots like the Baroness von Krudener. He helped create the Holy Alliance, a bizarre pact with Austria and Prussia pledging to rule according to Christian principles, a piece of paper that became a tool for crushing liberalism everywhere. The enlightened reformer vanished. In his place was a pious, withdrawn autocrat, haunted by guilt, over his father's death, over his failed reforms, over the toll of war. His personal life was a desert. He had no surviving legitimate children. The succession was a crisis waiting to happen. He became increasingly erratic, speaking of abdication, of disappearing to live as a monk. In 1825, while traveling in the remote, warm south of Russia in the city of Taganrog, he died of a sudden fever. Or did he? The circumstances were strange. The body, when returned to St. Petersburg, was reportedly badly decomposed and unrecognizable in its sealed coffin. A legend sprouted instantly that Alexander had staged his death, faked the illness, and slipped away to Siberia to live as a hermit named Fyodor Kuzmich. It was the perfect Romanov myth, the Tsar who traded absolute power for absolute anonymity, seeking penance. Whether true or not, it speaks to the aura of mystery and melancholy that clung to him. His death triggered not a smooth succession, but an explosion. He had two younger brothers, Constantine, the heir apparent, and Nicholas. Constantine, however, had secretly renounced his rights years earlier to marry a Polish woman who was not of royal blood. The throne was meant to pass to the third brother, Nicholas. But the paperwork was murky. The renunciation.
Into this farcical interregnum stepped a group of idealistic young army officers, the Decembrists, noble veterans of the Napoleonic Wars who had seen Europe and returned home to the stagnation of serfdom and autocracy. They saw their moment. On December 14, 1825, they marched their troops onto Senate Square in St. Petersburg, refusing to swear allegiance to Nicholas, calling for Constantine and Constitution. Many of the soldiers reportedly thought Constitution was Constantine's wife. Nicholas, the new Tsar, was a soldier by nature, a man of iron discipline and no imagination. He acted decisively. After failed negotiations, he ordered artillery to fire cannons loaded with grape shot into the packed square. The rebellion was crushed in blood and smoke. The leaders were hanged, others were exiled to Siberia. The first revolutionary challenge to the Romanov autocracy had been stillborn, drowned in imperial grape shot, and Nicholas I had his defining principle: order, not reform, not enlightenment. Order, enforced by the secret police, censorship, and the unblinking eye of the state. His reign became a 30-year frost. He was the gendarme of Europe, sending troops to crush revolutions in Hungary. At home, his motto was orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality. The state was a machine, and he was its chief engineer. He built railroads for the military. He codified laws to reinforce autocracy. He micromanaged everything. He created the third section, the dreaded political police whose reach extended into every corner of life. He was a family man, devoted to his wife Alexandra and rigidly moral in an often licentious court. He saw himself as the stern father of a vast, unruly family, Russia itself. But his system was brittle. It required a czar of superhuman will and attention at its center, and it was utterly unprepared for a real crisis. The crisis came in 1853 in a damp Crimean peninsula on the Black Sea. The Crimean War, a stupid, pointless war over obscure religious rights in the Ottoman Empire that pitted Russia against an alliance of Britain, France, and the Ottomans. Nicholas's Russia, the great European gendarme, marched confidently into conflict and was humiliated. The war exposed the rotten core of his system. The serf-based economy couldn't support a modern war. The bureaucracy was sclerotic. Russian smoothbore muskets faced Allied rifles. Wooden sailing ships faced ironclad steamers. The bravery of the Russian soldier, famously displayed in the doomed defense of Sevastopol, was no match for industrial might and logistical competence. Nicholas, the Iron Tsar, watched his life's work crumble. He caught a chill, refused treatment, and died in 1855, some said of a broken heart, others of suicide by despair. The war ended in defeat for his son, Alexander II. The myth of Russian invincibility and of the Nicholas system lay in the mud of the Crimean trenches. So picture the arc, from Paul's paranoid murder to Alexander's mystical flight from glory to Nicholas's brittle, crushing order. The Romanovs, in the first half of the 19th century, had become prisoners of their own myth. They were no longer expanding, no longer westernizing. They were defending, fortifying, trying to freeze a world that was melting around them. The gilded cage of autocracy was becoming a suffocating sarcophagus. And outside its walls, new ideas were stirring. Not just the noble idealism of the Decembrists, but harder, more dangerous ideologies born of the industrial age. The next czar would try to open the cage door from within. It would prove to be the most dangerous move of all. But that's a tragedy of good intentions for another night. For now, picture Nicholas I on his bedfall, the thunder of Allied cannon at Sevastopol echoing in his ears, the frozen system he built already cracking under the weight of its own impossibility. The long Russian winter of the soul was deepening. Sleep well. The cannon smoke over Sevastopol cleared, revealing a landscape of defeat, not just of an army, but of an idea. The iron clockwork of Nicholas I's Russia had broken down in the mud and blood of the Crimea, and onto this stage of ruin walked his son, Alexander II. He was 36, not a warrior like his father, but a man who understood necessity. The system was bankrupt. To save the empire, he would have to dismantle its very foundations. He would become known as the Tsar Liberator, a title that would hang over his reign and his death with terrible irony. His great work, the one that defined him, was the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. 23 million human beings, legally owned as property, were granted personal freedom and a sliver of land. It was the single largest act of emancipation in history before the American Civil War. It was also a colossal bureaucratic fudge. The serfs were freed, but they had to pay redemption dues for their land for decades, often to the very nobles who had owned them. They were tied to the village commune, the mir, which controlled the land. It was liberty, but a hobbled, complicated, deeply Russian kind of liberty. It pleased almost no one. The nobles felt robbed, the peasants felt cheated, the radicals felt it wasn't enough.
But it was a seismic shift. It cracked the ancient, frozen soil of Russian society. And Alexander didn't stop there. He reformed the judicial system, introducing trial by jury and public proceedings, a radical concept. He modernized the military, ending the brutal 25-year conscription terms. He created elected local councils, the Zemstvos, which allowed a flicker of self-government. He was, in essence, trying to build a modern state from the top down. It was a breathtaking project of enlightened autocracy, and it made him enemies on all sides. To the right, the land-owning nobles, the court conservatives, he was a traitor to his class and his father's legacy, unleashing dangerous forces of change. To the left, the growing intelligentsia, the students, the radical thinkers, he was a half-measure artist, a tyrant offering crumbs when the people needed the whole loaf. In the newly opened space of public life, a new, virulent ideology grew. Nihilism, then populism, then terrorism. The People's Will, a radical group, decided the only way to save Russia was to kill its Tsar. Alexander's personal life was a quiet counterpoint to the public storm. After the early death of his beloved wife, Empress Maria Alexandrovna, he fell deeply in love with a much younger woman, Princess Catherine Dolgorukova. He married her in a secret ceremony, making her his morganatic wife, and had children with her. He found in her a refuge from the crushing pressures of rule and the constant threats on his life. The conservative court was scandalized. It was another crack in the imperial facade. The threats were not abstract. The People's Will tried and failed to kill him again and again. They shot at his train. They blew up a dining room in the Winter Palace, killing guards but missing him. They were relentless, a small, fanatical shadow war against the giant state. With each attempt, Alexander retreated further, his reforms stalling, his rule becoming more defensive. The liberator was becoming a prisoner in his own palaces. Then, on March 1st, 1881, a bright, cold Sunday in St. Petersburg, Alexander, against all advice, went to review his guards. On the way back, along the Catherine Canal, a young nihilist named Nikolai Rizikov threw a bomb under the Tsar's armored carriage. The explosion was deafening. Soldiers and Cossacks were maimed. A boy was killed. The Tsar's carriage was damaged, but he was unhurt.
He stepped out, shaken, to survey the carnage and check on the wounded. Another conspirator, Ignacy Hryniewski, seeing his chance, stepped forward and threw a second bomb directly at Alexander's feet. This one did its work. The Tsar's legs were shattered, his belly torn open. He was carried, bleeding, to the Winter Palace. In a quiet room, surrounded by his weeping family, the Tsar Liberator bled to death. His last act, earlier that very morning, had been to sign a document approving the creation of a consultative assembly, a tiny, hesitant step toward a constitutional monarchy. The paper lay on his desk, unsigned by the Council of Ministers. It died with him. The assassination was the watershed. The era of reform from above was over, drowned in the Tsar's own blood on the snow. The new Tsar, Alexander III, was a giant of a man, physically massive, with a will of granite and the mind of a determined reactionary. He saw his father's death as divine judgment on liberalism. His philosophy was simple: crush. Crush the radicals, crush the minorities, crush any whisper of dissent. He rolled back his father's reforms, strengthened the secret police, and pursued a policy of Russification, forcing the empire's diverse peoples to speak Russian and adopt orthodoxy. Autocracy was reclenched into a fist. He ruled by fear for 13 years and died of nephritis in 1994. The throne passed to his son, Nicholas II, a slight, gentle, unimaginative man of 26 who wrote